Part 10, Legacy and the Abundant Future Beyond 2026. Chapter 91. Davos 2026, the Post-Scarcity Economy. The snow outside the Congress Centrum had been falling since before dawn, and by the time the moderator introduced him, the alpine dark had turned the floor-to-ceiling windows into mirrors, and Elon Musk was looking at his own reflection without appearing to see it. He had arrived in Davos not by the chartered helicopter that most principals of his stature preferred. The mountain weather had grounded the rotors, but by motorcade along roads that the Swiss had salted and sanded with their characteristic precision. And the delay had given him 45 minutes in the back of an armored vehicle with nothing to do but think, which was, for a man whose entire architecture of self was organized around motion and output, a condition approximately equivalent to sensory deprivation. He walked onto the stage with the particular energy of someone who has been thinking too hard for too long in a small space and has finally been given permission to release it. The audience, which contained more concentrated institutional power per square meter than almost any room on Earth, watched him settle into his chair with the careful attention of people who have learned at considerable expense that underestimating this man is the category error from which careers do not recover. It was January 2026, and Davos was performing, as it does every year, its ritual of anxious consensus. The forum's theme, Collaboration for the Intelligent Age, had been selected many months earlier by people trying to anticipate the future, and it had arrived exactly on time to feel both prescient and completely inadequate. The intelligent age was not approaching. It was already here, already rewriting the labor markets of 17 countries simultaneously, already making decisions in financial systems and healthcare networks and military logistics chains that the humans nominally overseeing those systems were only partially equipped to audit. The economists on the panels before Musk had used the word disruption so many times it had ceased to carry information. The central bankers had spoken in the clipped, heavily qualified language of people managing fires they cannot name aloud. The geopolitical sessions had been darker than usual, with a texture of controlled alarm beneath the diplomatic syntax that longtime attendees recognized as different in kind, not just degree, from the anxiety of previous years. The world's institutional class had gathered in the Alps, as it does, to reassure itself that the people in charge understood what was happening. On the evidence of the first 2 days, the reassurance was not landing. And then there was Musk. The specific gravity of his presence at Davos 2026 was different from any previous appearance, and the difference was not incidental. He was no longer merely the most consequential entrepreneur of his generation, a designation that had been accurate for years, but was now insufficient the way calling Newton a mathematician is technically accurate but misses the point. He was at this moment arguably the most powerful private citizen in the recorded history of private citizenship, a man whose companies controlled access to space, whose satellite network provided internet connectivity to populations that had never had it before, and to military operations that depended on it in ways governments were only beginning to acknowledge publicly, whose artificial intelligence subsidiary was training models on infrastructure of a scale that made the previous generation of AI labs look like garage experiments, and whose social media platform had become, for better and worse, and for reasons that would occupy sociologists for decades, the primary real-time communications layer for a significant fraction of the global political conversation. He had spent the previous months embedded, formally and informally, in the transition architecture of the incoming American administration in ways that had not been tried before, and for which there was no established protocol and no established limit. He arrived at Davos not as a supplicant seeking legitimacy from the institutional world, the way he might have a decade earlier. He arrived as something the forum had not previously had to accommodate, a peer who had, by most operational measures, outgrown the room. The obstacle he faced in Davos was one that power of sufficient magnitude always eventually generates: the problem of being believed. Not believed in the sense of credibility. His credibility, staked across 2 decades of delivering things that experts had declared impossible, was not seriously in question. The problem was more subtle and more dangerous. It was the problem of the vision, becoming so large, so internally consistent, and so reliant on a future that only he could fully see that the gap between what he was describing and what his audience could independently verify had grown too wide for ordinary trust to bridge. He was asking the most skeptical, most analytically sophisticated, most institutionally defended audience on Earth to accept that the convergence of artificial intelligence and advanced robotics was not a threat requiring management but an opportunity requiring surrender. Surrender of the old economic assumptions, the old labor frameworks, the old political categories that had organized Western civilization since the Industrial Revolution. He was telling them, in effect, that scarcity itself was about to become optional, that the binding constraint on human flourishing had always been productive capacity rather than human nature or resource limitation, and that the systems now coming online would dissolve that constraint the way antibiotics had dissolved the constraint of bacterial infection. It was an argument of extraordinary ambition. The room received it with the expression of people who are not sure whether they are listening to a prophet or to a very confident man who has been right enough times that they cannot afford to dismiss him and cannot quite bring themselves to fully follow. The keyhole moment came not during the prepared remarks, but in the question period that followed, when a German economist, a veteran of 3 decades of Davos panels, a man whose skepticism was structural rather than personal, put to Musk the question that the room had been thinking but performing too much politeness to ask directly. If the post-scarcity economy Musk was describing was genuinely arriving, the economist said, and if the primary beneficiary of the AI and robotics transition was the capital that owned the systems rather than the labor those systems were replacing, then what Musk was actually describing was not abundance, but the most extreme concentration of productive wealth in human history, controlled by a very small number of entities, of which his own collection of companies was the most prominent example. What, the economist asked, with the particular precision of a man who has been sharpening this question for 2 days, were the democratic mechanisms by which ordinary people would govern that concentration? Musk was quiet for a moment that ran about 2 seconds longer than the room expected. It was not a silence of being caught. Those who had watched him across many years knew the difference between the silence of the man who does not have an answer and the silence of the man who has too many answers and is selecting among them according to criteria invisible to the observer. When he spoke, he did not answer the question about democratic mechanisms. He answered a different question, about the historical precedents for transformative technology, about the printing press and electricity and the internet, about how each of those transitions had looked in the moment of maximum disruption, like the end of something rather than the beginning of something larger, and how in each case the people most alarmed by the transition had been the people with the most invested in the system being disrupted. It was a brilliant answer. It was genuinely responsive to several of the underlying assumptions in the economist's question. It did not address the democratic mechanisms. The German economist wrote something in the margin of his program and did not ask a follow-up because the format did not permit it, which may or may not have been relevant. The person in the room watching this exchange most carefully was not a head of state or a central banker or a technology rival. It was Sam Altman, the chief executive of OpenAI, who occupied a seat in the 3rd row with the slightly formal posture of a man who is being observed observing. The relationship between Musk and Altman was one of the more consequential and genuinely strange in the history of the technology industry. A friendship that had become a co-founding partnership, that had become an acrimonious split, that had become a lawsuit, that had become a competition between organizations whose missions were framed in near identical language, and whose actual values, their critics and their admirers would argue in permanent disagreement, were either fundamentally different or uncomfortably similar depending on which week you were asking. Musk had founded OpenAI with Altman in 2015 on the stated premise that artificial general intelligence was too dangerous to be controlled by any single commercial entity and needed to be developed openly for the benefit of humanity. He had departed the board in 2018. OpenAI had subsequently reorganized in ways that Musk argued had abandoned the founding mission entirely. He had founded xAI as a competitor and sued OpenAI in terms that were partly legal and partly a very public philosophical argument about what the organization he had helped create had become. At Davos 2026, the 2 men were operating competing AGI laboratories, each claiming the mantle of the responsible path forward, each watching the other with the attention of people who understand that what the other does next will matter enormously and cannot be predicted with confidence. After the session, in the corridor that Davos uses for the conversations that are more important than the ones that happen on stage, Musk and Altman were observed speaking briefly, privately, with the body language of two people who share a reference frame that the rest of the room does not have access to. What was said was not recorded, and neither man subsequently disclosed it. Those nearby noted only that the conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, and that both men afterward moved in opposite directions through the crowd with the purposeful velocity of people who have settled something or decided it cannot be settled, and have moved on to the next calculation. What Davos 2026 revealed, for those paying attention at the right resolution, was not the argument Musk made on stage. The post-scarcity thesis was not new, and he had been making versions of it for years with increasing elaboration. What it revealed was the degree to which he had ceased to experience the institutional world as a check on his trajectory, and had begun to experience it as an audience. The distinction matters. A check implies reciprocal power, the possibility of constraint, the existence of a force capable of altering the outcome. An audience implies attention without agency. People who are watching, who have opinions, who may applaud or object, but who are not in a position to change what is about to happen. The men and women in that room in Davos, presidents of central banks, finance ministers of G7 nations, chief executives of companies whose revenues exceeded the GDP of medium-sized countries, had spent their careers in institutions whose authority derived from exactly the kind of accumulated legitimacy and democratic mandate that Musk had never possessed and had never needed. They could write regulations. They could convene hearings. They could, in theory, coordinate responses. In January 2026, watching him from their chairs, as he talked about the end of scarcity with the focused calm of someone describing a mathematical proof rather than making a political argument, several of them arrived privately at a version of the same uncomfortable realization. The coordination mechanisms they possessed had been designed for a world in which the entities they were coordinating to govern needed something those institutions controlled: capital, market access, legal permission, political legitimacy. Musk had spent 20 years systematically reducing his dependence on each of these in sequence, and the question of what leverage remained was one that the room's collective intelligence was only beginning to seriously formulate. He left Davos before the closing dinner, which was also something people noted, in the way that people in rooms like that note everything about the person they cannot stop watching. His motorcade rejoined the salted roads in the alpine dark, and somewhere above the weather system that had grounded the helicopters, a Starship prototype was completing the data collection phase of a trajectory test that would determine the load parameters for the next generation of orbital infrastructure. The infrastructure that was, according to the roadmaps his engineers had filed with the appropriate regulatory bodies in appropriately technical language, intended to serve as the physical backbone of a computing network whose scale the regulatory bodies had not yet developed the conceptual framework to evaluate. He was not in the motorcade thinking about Davos. The people who knew him best would have staked their professional reputations on that. He was thinking about the next thing, the thing after abundance, the problem that post-scarcity itself would generate, which was the problem of purpose, what human beings are for when the machines have relieved them of the burden of production. And it was the one question from the entire forum that no one had thought to ask him, which was itself information about the distance between where he was and where the room was, and about how much of what was coming was going to arrive before the questions caught up to it. The lawsuit that OpenAI's board had been quietly preparing, and that Altman's legal team had been equally quietly anticipating Musk's team would file first, was drafted and in review at a law firm in San Francisco, and neither man, in their 3-minute corridor conversation, had mentioned it, which was either an act of unusual discipline or a sign that they both already knew that whatever came next between them was going to be decided somewhere other than a courtroom. Chapter 92. The Robotics Multiplier, Robots Outnumbering Humans. The Optimus unit, designated Test Article 7, stumbled on a floor seam roughly the width of a thumbnail, and in the half-second before its balance recovery algorithm caught the fall, every engineer in the Austin demonstration bay held their breath in the specific way that people hold their breath when they know that what they are watching is either the beginning of something historic or the beginning of a very expensive postmortem. The robot caught itself. It continued across the factory floor, picked up the component it had been dispatched to retrieve, a cylindrical lithium cell module, precisely the weight and geometry the training regime had specified, and returned it to the assembly station with a motion that was, depending on your threshold for the word, either competent or eerie. Musk, watching from the observation platform above, said nothing for a moment that the engineers nearby would later describe, with the imprecision of people trying to quantify atmosphere, as the longest 10 seconds of the quarter. Then he said, "Run it again, but change the cell to the one with the irregular housing." Nobody moved immediately, because the irregular housing component was the one that had defeated the previous 4 iterations of the grasping algorithm across 11 separate test sessions. Someone retrieved it anyway, because nobody in a room with Musk declines a direct instruction while processing the implications of it. And test Article 7 was repositioned at the far end of the bay, and the engineers watched Musk watch the machine with an expression that contained, in roughly equal proportion, the impatience of a man who already knows how the thing ends, and the hunger of a man who needs to see it happen in physical space before he can fully believe it himself. The spring of 2026 arrived in Austin with the particular quality of light that makes the hill country look temporarily innocent, and Tesla's gigafactory there had been producing Optimus units at a rate that would have seemed like projection fantasy 18 months earlier. The numbers were not yet public in their full specificity, but the people who track supply chains for a living, the analysts who count shipping containers and monitor rare earth import manifests, and cross-reference job postings in robotics component manufacturing with production floor footage from satellite imaging, had been updating their models upward with the nervous frequency of people who keep being wrong in the same direction. The world into which the Optimus program was accelerating in the first half of 2026 was one that had been softened for it in ways both intended and unintended. Labor shortages in manufacturing, logistics, eldercare, and construction had not resolved the way post-pandemic economic theory had predicted they would. Wages had risen, in some sectors dramatically, and the workers had not materialized in proportionate numbers regardless. The political response to this in the United States had been characteristically incoherent, a simultaneous insistence by one faction that automation was the enemy of the worker, and by another that it was the inevitable destiny of the market, and by a third that the real problem was regulatory capture preventing domestic manufacturing competitiveness, a diagnosis whose prescribed remedy happened to be, in every case, whatever that faction had already wanted. Into this environment, Musk had been deploying his argument with the patient regularity of a man who believes that repetition is not a rhetorical strategy, but a service to people who have not yet caught up to the math. The math, as he presented it in a series of appearances and posts and engineering briefings through the first half of 2026, was not complicated in its architecture, only in its implications. A humanoid robot capable of performing the physical tasks that constitute the majority of compensated human labor, material handling, assembly, maintenance, caregiving, construction, agriculture, and capable of doing so continuously without benefits or healthcare costs, or the accumulated wear of biological aging, represented not merely a productivity enhancement, but a phase transition in the relationship between human population and economic output. Every prior technological revolution, Musk argued, had expanded what a given number of humans could produce. The robotics multiplier was different in kind. It decoupled production from human population entirely. The question of how many workers a society possessed became, in this framing, as strategically relevant as the question of how many horses it possessed had become after the internal combustion engine arrived. He put the eventual ratio at figures that his audiences generally received, with the specific silence of people encountering a number too large for intuitive processing. Not 10 robots per human worker, not 100, but potentially billions of units operating in an economy where the binding constraint on productive capacity had been permanently lifted. He said this in the tone of someone reporting a weather forecast, and the effect was, each time, a kind of conversational vertigo. The obstacle was not technical, or not primarily technical, though the technical obstacles were real and ongoing, and occupied the engineering teams at Tesla with a granular ferocity that the public presentations did not convey. The obstacle was the oldest one that transformative technology encounters at the moment it transitions from theoretical to imminent. The people whose lives it will reorganize become, in that moment, active rather than passive participants in the question of whether it proceeds. The labor movement's response to the Optimus program in early 2026 was neither monolithic nor fully coordinated, but it was louder and better organized than anything Musk had faced from that quarter in the previous decade. Unions in the automotive sector, already navigating the structural disruption of the EV transition, identified in the humanoid robot program an existential threat of a different category than the ones they had been managing. Legislative proposals appeared in 6 states and in 3 European Union member countries that would have imposed moratoriums, licensing requirements, displacement taxes, or in the most aggressive versions, outright prohibitions on deploying autonomous humanoid systems in categories of work defined as essential labor. None of these proposals passed. Several came closer than the technology press reported. And behind each of them was the same underlying question that the German economist at Davos had put to Musk in slightly different form. In a world where machines own the means of production and are themselves owned by a very small number of entities, what mechanism ensures that the abundance generated flows outward rather than upward? Musk's response to this question, in the spring of 2026, took a form that was characteristic enough to serve as a reliable indicator of his operating psychology. He did not engage the legislative proposals in the arenas where they were being debated. He did not hire lobbyists in the conventional sense, though Tesla's government relations function was not unoccupied. What he did instead was accelerate. In the weeks when the most aggressive European proposals were attracting the most press coverage, the Optimus production line in Austin was reconfigured to increase output. The test deployment program, which had been placing units in controlled industrial settings for observation and data collection, was expanded to include a distribution facility in Nevada and a component manufacturing plant in Ohio. The expansion was framed publicly in the language of operational validation, standard engineering practice, the accumulation of real-world performance data necessary for responsible scaling. The timing was not accidental, and nobody who observed Musk closely believed it was. He was doing what he had done with SpaceX when aviation regulators moved slowly, and with Tesla when dealer franchise laws created headwinds. He was building facts on the ground faster than the institutional response could organize itself to contest them. It was, depending on your values, either brilliant competitive strategy or a systematic pattern of treating democratic deliberation as an obstacle to be outrun rather than a process to be engaged. The moment that served as the truest window into what he actually believed, not the performed version of the belief deployed in public presentations, but the operative conviction underneath, came during an internal engineering review in late March 2026, one of the recurring sessions where Musk sat with the Optimus hardware and software teams and worked through the gap between current performance and the roadmap targets. A senior engineer on the locomotion team, presenting data on fall recovery latency across uneven terrain, noted that the current algorithm performed within acceptable parameters on surfaces that accounted for roughly 94% of real-world industrial environments. Musk stopped him. What happens in the other 6%? The engineer explained. Edge cases, unusual surface geometries, environments that hadn't been adequately represented in training data, scenarios where the recovery system defaulted to a controlled stop rather than a recovery motion. Musk was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the flat specificity of someone who has already decided, the other 6% is where the system has to be better than a human, not equivalent. Because a human in the other 6% gets hurt. A robot in the other 6% just gets better data. He moved to the next agenda item. The engineers wrote it down, not because they had been asked to, but because they understood from experience that statements delivered in that register were the ones that reorganized the work. The figure whose presence shaped the Optimus chapter most distinctly from inside the organization was not an engineer and not an executive in the formal hierarchy. It was Milan Kovac, the head of the Optimus program, a roboticist whose background spanned academic research in locomotion control and applied work in industrial automation, and who had been recruited to Tesla with the understanding that the project he was being asked to run was either the most important engineering program on Earth or a magnificently funded exercise in accelerating toward a wall, depending on variables that would not be fully resolved for years. Kovacs operated with a combination of technical precision and organizational steadiness that the Optimus program required, in almost exactly the proportion in which Musk's leadership style made it scarce. Where Musk set timelines that the engineering reality could not honor, and targets that required the teams to choose between honest reporting and continued employment, Kovacs had developed a practice of translating. He absorbed the target, assessed the gap between the target and the achievable, and presented back to Musk not a negotiation but a decomposition. Here are the specific sub-problems whose solution produces the outcome you want. Here's the sequence. Here's where we are in each one. It was a communication strategy that worked with Musk in the way that very few communication strategies did, because it met him in the register he actually inhabited, which was the register of problems and their constituent parts, rather than the register of expectations and their management. By the spring of 2026, the relationship between Musk and Kovacs had settled into something that those who witnessed it described as productive, in the specific way that productive is distinguished from pleasant. Two people who share a destination and disagree regularly and consequentially about the route, and who have arrived at the implicit understanding that the disagreements make the outcome more likely rather than less. What the spring of 2026 was producing, beneath the earnings reports and the legislative hearings and the demonstration events staged for press and investors with the careful choreography of people managing perception at industrial scale, was a body of operational data that would take years to fully analyze and whose implications were not yet visible even to the people generating it. Tens of thousands of hours of real-world task performance by Optimus units in actual production environments, accumulating in servers in Austin and Nevada, and at Zay's compute facilities, being processed by training pipelines whose architecture was classified at a level of commercial sensitivity that made the engineers involved unusually reluctant to speak even to colleagues in adjacent departments. The data was teaching the machines things that the machines' designers had not anticipated teaching them, because real environments are more various and more resistant than simulated ones, and because the gap between what a system is designed to learn and what it actually learns when exposed to sufficient complexity and volume is the gap where all the interesting things happen. Musk understood this better than he usually said publicly, because to say it publicly was to invite a category of question he preferred to encounter on his own terms and timeline, which is to say, later, when the facts on the ground were established enough that the terms of the debate had shifted in his favor, as they had a tendency with him to do. The labor economists who had been modeling the displacement effects of broad humanoid robot deployment had been, through the early months of 2026, revising their timeline projections downward, not because the technology had suddenly leapt forward in any single discontinuous event, but because the cumulative effect of the operational data coming out of the test deployments was compressing the interval between current capability and threshold capability faster than the models had assumed. The economists used phrases like adoption curve steepening and capability inflection approaching in the technical language of people who are describing something alarming in the vocabulary of something manageable, because the vocabulary of something alarming was not available to them in the professional contexts where they were doing their work without generating the kind of attention that made institutional funders nervous. What none of them had modeled, because it had not yet happened, and because modeling things that have not happened requires a willingness to follow a logical chain to conclusions that feel irresponsible to publish, was what occurs to the political economy of labor when the timeline compresses past the point where democratic institutions can adapt, not because the institutions are broken, but because adaptation requires time and the timeline has stopped providing it. Musk had spent 26 years building companies that ran faster than the regulatory frameworks designed to govern them, and the pattern had produced outcomes that were, on the ledger he maintained, overwhelmingly positive. Rockets that flew, cars that did not burn fossil fuels, internet access in places that had never had it, the progressive demolition of the artificial scarcity that had always been, in his analysis, the primary enemy of human flourishing. The pattern had also produced something else, quieter and accumulating, in the institutional memory of governments and labor organizations and civil society groups on 4 continents, and that something was beginning in the spring of 2026 to organize itself into a response whose shape was not yet visible but whose arrival, for anyone paying the right kind of attention, was no longer a matter of speculation, only of timing, and of which would arrive first, the abundance he was building or the reckoning it was generating. Chapter 93. The Mars Timeline, 2028 Uncrewed Missions. The sound reached the observation bunker before the light did, which is not how the physics works, but is how witnesses consistently remember it. Because the human nervous system, confronted with something of sufficient magnitude, processes sensation in the order of emotional impact rather than chronological sequence. The seventh fully integrated Starship test vehicle lifted from the Boca Chica pad in the blue-gray light of a South Texas morning in the spring of 2026, and the sound that arrived at the bunker 3 seconds later was not the cracking roar that earlier iterations had produced, but something lower and more total, a pressure rather than a noise, a rearrangement of the air itself that you felt in the sternum and the back teeth and the base of the skull before you consciously registered that you were hearing anything at all. Elon Musk, standing at the blast-resistant glass with his arms crossed and his weight slightly forward on the balls of his feet, did not react the way people react when something goes right after a long time going wrong. He did not exhale or unclench or allow the posture of controlled tension to resolve into anything warmer. He watched the vehicle climb through the first stage of ascent with the expression of a man who is not celebrating a success, but auditing a confirmation, checking the behavior of the thing against the model of it he has been carrying in his head for years, looking not at what is happening, but at the delta between what is happening and what was supposed to, and finding in this particular morning a delta too small to see with the naked eye, which was the closest he was going to come in the operational moment to joy. The spring of 2026 was the season in which the Mars timeline stopped being a projection and became, in the vocabulary of aerospace engineering, a program. The distinction is not semantic. A projection is a claim about the future made by someone who has studied the trajectory and extended the line. A program is a set of specific vehicles, specific trajectories, specific mass budgets and launch windows and surface operations plans, with names on them, and funding allocated to them, and engineers who have been told this is the thing they are building now. SpaceX had been publishing Mars timelines since the earliest days of Falcon development, and the relationship between those timelines and the actual calendar of events had been, over the preceding decade and a half, roughly what you would expect from an organization that sets its targets by asking what would need to be true for the hardest version of this to work, rather than what is most likely given current capability. The 2018 timeline had slipped. The 2022 timeline had slipped. The technology journalists who covered aerospace for a living had developed, across those years, a professional discipline about Musk's Mars dates that resembled the discipline an experienced cardiologist develops about patient prognoses. You acknowledge the target, you note the variables. You do not attach your credibility to the specific number because the specific number is not the point and has never been the point. The point is the direction. In the spring of 2026, the direction had acquired velocity that changed the nature of the conversation. Starship had achieved full reusability across multiple consecutive flights in a way that the vehicle's critics, and they were numerous, credentialed, and not wrong about many of the specific technical objections they had raised across years of public skepticism, had argued was either impossible in the near term or achievable only at costs that negated the economic case for the program. The costs had not been negated. The heat shield tiles that had been the most intractable engineering problem through the middle phases of development had been redesigned with a material and installation approach that reduced both the replacement rate and the turnaround time below the threshold that made rapid reuse operationally plausible. The methane-oxygen Raptor engines, which had gone through iteration cycles that consumed entire engineering teams and enormous capital, and which had produced failures public enough to become reliable fodder for the online communities devoted to cataloging SpaceX's difficulties, had stabilized at a reliability figure that the program's internal targets had specified, but that most external analysis had not expected to see achieved this side of 2028. And now, on a Tuesday morning in spring, with the seventh test vehicle completing its booster catch, and Stage 2 continuing on a trajectory that the telemetry confirmed was within the margins of the Trans-Mars injection profile the mission planning team had been refining for 3 years, the 2028 uncrewed mission date had acquired the specific weight of something that was going to happen. The external obstacle Musk faced in this chapter was the one that had accompanied the Mars program since its inception, had intensified as Starship development matured from aspiration to engineering reality, and had acquired in 2026 a new set of institutional sponsors who gave it a staying power it had previously lacked. The obstacle was authorization. Not physical authorization. The atmosphere of Mars does not require a permit, and the Outer Space Treaty's framework for private mission approval, while genuinely complex, was not an insurmountable technical barrier. The obstacle was the emerging alignment between regulatory bodies, a contingent of the scientific community, and a number of governments whose interest in space was defensive rather than exploratory, all of whom had arrived, by different routes, at the same anxious question. Under what framework does a private individual decide to begin the process of establishing a permanent human presence on another planet? And what recourse does anyone else have if they object to the terms? NASA's institutional position on the 2028 mission timeline had the layered texture of an organization that was simultaneously a partner, a dependent, a competitor, and a regulator. A position that produced, in practice, communications of extraordinary caution that said several things at once and committed to none of them. The FAA's launch licensing process had been reformed in the previous administration in ways that SpaceX had publicly advocated for and privately helped shape, but the question of what regulatory authority governed a mission that departed Earth's atmosphere for a destination outside any national jurisdiction was one that existing frameworks had not resolved, and that multiple parties were now actively attempting to resolve in ways that would give them maximum leverage over the answer. Musk's response to this obstacle followed his established operating procedure with sufficient fidelity that describing it feels almost redundant by this point in any account of his life. He treated the regulatory uncertainty as an engineering problem, identified the critical path that ran around the longest lead time constraints, and advanced along that path while the institutional conversation continued to organize itself in the buildings where institutional conversations happen. The 2028 mission architecture was, in this reading, a design choice with regulatory consequences rather than a regulatory submission awaiting institutional approval. The two Starship vehicles designated for the first uncrewed Mars transit were not named in public documents. They were not named in public. They were referred to, in internal documentation, by designations that the small number of people cleared to handle mission-specific planning, used in contexts where operational security had been elevated from normal commercial practice to something closer to the protocols associated with classified government programs. The fact that a private company was applying something resembling classification protocols to a mission architecture was itself a data point that a number of people in Washington and Brussels and Beijing were actively processing with varying degrees of alarm. The moment that reveals him most completely in this chapter occurred not at a launch or a press conference or in the theatrical context of a public demonstration, but in a mission planning session in the late afternoon of a Wednesday in April 2026, in a conference room at SpaceX's Hawthorne facility that had the functional aesthetic of a space that exists to hold whiteboards and the people who argue in front of them. The discussion had turned to the surface operations plan for the uncrewed missions, specifically to the question of what the vehicles would do after landing, assuming landing was achieved in the roughly 26 months before the next launch window. The mission planning team had prepared three options, ranging from minimal surface interaction to an aggressive site preparation program that would use onboard systems to begin the initial stages of creating infrastructure conditions for eventual crewed operations. The engineers presenting the options had framed them carefully, with the appropriate language about risk tolerance and mission scope, and the value of incremental validation. Musk listened to all three presentations without interrupting, which the people in the room noted, because interrupting is his default mode during technical reviews, and its absence signals something. When the last presentation concluded, he was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Option 3, but we need a fourth option that option 3 is the conservative version of." The engineers exchanged the specific glance of people who have been in this room before. Someone asked what the fourth option would look like. Musk said, "I don't know yet, that's why I need you to design it." He stood up and left the room, and the engineers spent the next 4 hours at the whiteboards, which was, everyone in the room understood, the intended outcome of the entire exchange. The figure whose role in the Mars chapter was most significant, and whose significance was least visible to the outside world, was not an aerospace engineer or a mission planner. It was Gwynne Shotwell, SpaceX's president and chief operating officer, who had been translating between Musk's vision an operational reality for more than 2 decades, and who occupied within the organization the specific function of the person who knows where everything actually is. The relationship between Musk and Shotwell had always been most accurately described not in the vocabulary of personal dynamics, but in the vocabulary of complementary cognitive architecture. He operated at the level of the first principle and the endpoint. She operated at the level of the specific sequence of steps between the first principle and the endpoint, and at the level of the people who had to execute each step and what they needed to be able to do so. By 2026, Shotwell had navigated SpaceX through the early Falcon failures, the Tesla crisis years when Musk's attention had been pulled so severely that colleagues feared he would lose both companies simultaneously, the Crew Dragon development program, the Starlink deployment, the Starship development process with all of its public combustions and setbacks, and the gradual transformation of the company from a launch services provider into something that did not have a clean prior category. She had also navigated, with the practiced composure of someone who has made a deliberate choice about what she is willing to absorb in service of a mission she genuinely believes in, the accumulated weight of working for a person whose gifts and pathologies are inseparable from each other, and whose capacity to demand the impossible from the people around him is the same capacity that has, repeatedly, made the impossible happen. In the spring of 2026, as the 2028 mission timeline hardened from projection to program, Shotwell was managing the operational complexity of a vehicle production rate, a launch cadence, a mission planning process, and a regulatory engagement strategy simultaneously, in the way that she always managed things, which was thoroughly and without the kind of public credit that the throughput required. What the spring of 2026 produced, in the specific domain of the Mars program, was a species of clarity that had been building for years and that now arrived with enough force to reorganize the terms of the public conversation about it. The question of whether Musk would attempt to send spacecraft to Mars in 2028 had, through the preceding years, carried the implicit qualifier, if the technology permits. That qualifier was no longer structurally available. The technology, within the margins of what could be responsibly claimed, permitted. The vehicle existed. The trajectory had been analyzed and confirmed by multiple independent teams, including ones with no institutional loyalty to SpaceX, and significant professional incentives to find problems if problems were findable. The launch windows of 2028 were 26 months away, and 26 months was, by the engineering calendar of a program at this stage of development, not a comfortable margin but a workable one. The 2028 missions would almost certainly not go exactly as planned, because nothing in aerospace goes exactly as planned, and because Mars is 4 light minutes away at closest approach, and the surface conditions are not fully characterized, and the dust storm season is genuinely dangerous, and the landing radar has to work on the first try because there is no second try. But they were going to go. And the world, which had been processing Musk's Mars intentions as a rich man's extravagant ambition for long enough that the processing had become habitual, was going to have to update that processing into something else, something for which the vocabulary was only beginning to be assembled. The governments that had been watching the Starship program, with the careful attention of entities that understand that whoever establishes durable presence on Mars first will have established a set of facts with geopolitical consequences that no subsequent negotiation can fully undo, were, in the spring of 2026, doing something that governments do when they recognize that a situation is developing faster than their response capacity. They were convening working groups. The working groups were producing documents. The documents were identifying options. The options included several that had not previously been part of the mainstream policy conversation about private space activity, and at least 2 that, if pursued, would require a degree of coordination between governments that had not been achieved on any comparable issue in the preceding decade. The working groups were moving at the speed of institutions, which is to say they were moving at a speed calibrated to the world that existed before Starship. And the thing about the world that existed before Starship was that it was ending, in the particular and irrevocable way that worlds end when someone builds something large enough to make the old maps wrong. And the question of what happened when the first of those vehicles crossed the orbital threshold toward a destination no government had claimed and no treaty had adequately addressed was one that 26 months was not going to be enough time to answer, though it was, it turned out, exactly enough time for the question to become unavoidable. Chapter 94. The man-child critique, personal volatility. The post went up at 2:17 in the morning, and by 2:19 it had been seen by 400,000 people, and by 2:23 the ratio, the particular metric of social media distress that measures hostile replies against likes, a number that for most public figures correlates reliably with career damage and for Musk correlates with nothing predictable at all, had reached a proportion that would have sent any conventional communications director into emergency protocol. The target of the post was a journalist at a financial publication who had published, the previous afternoon, an analysis of Tesla's governance structure, arguing that the concentration of decision-making authority in a single individual who was simultaneously running 6 other organizations of global consequence represented a systemic risk that the company's institutional shareholders were underpricing. The analysis was carefully sourced. It contained no factual errors that anyone subsequently identified. Musk's response did not engage its argument. It described the journalist by name as a legacy media parasite who wouldn't know a balance sheet from a bathroom tile, appended a meme image that had originated in a corner of internet culture associated with adolescent antagonism, and concluded with a suggestion that the journalist's publication, which had been in operation for several decades and had broken several significant financial stories, would be irrelevant within 18 months. He had posted it from his phone, in the dark, in whatever room he was in, and had then, apparently, gone to sleep, because there were no further posts until nearly noon the following day, by which time the financial press had generated approximately 40 separate articles about the original post and its implications, none of which he appeared to have read. The summer of 2026 was the season in which the critique of Musk's personal volatility reached what might be called critical institutional mass, the point at which a concern that had existed for years in the commentary class graduated into a concern being actively discussed in the boardrooms and investment committee meetings and regulatory offices that had previously treated it as either irrelevant or too politically complicated to engage. The context that produced this graduation was not any single incident, but the accumulated weight of a pattern that had been running long enough that the people whose job it is to evaluate long-term risk had generated sufficient data points to plot a curve. There had been the cave rescuer episode in 2018, in which Musk had publicly accused a British diver involved in the Thai cave rescue of being a pedophile, an accusation without foundation that had resulted in a lawsuit Musk ultimately settled, and which had been explained at the time as an anomalous eruption under extraordinary stress. There had been the Tesla private tweet in the same year, a single sentence that had triggered an SEC investigation, a settlement, a consent decree, and a years-long legal entanglement that consumed organizational resources and management attention on a scale that the company's shareholders had borne without adequate accounting. There had been the accumulated catalog of late-night posts targeting critics, competitors, journalists, scientists, former employees, and in several cases private citizens whose primary offense had been saying something on the internet that Musk disagreed with. And there had been the particular quality of the X platform's transformation under his ownership, the reinstatement of accounts that had been suspended for documented harassment, the systematic reduction of content moderation infrastructure, the personal interventions in the platform's algorithmic behavior that had the effect of amplifying his own posts and the posts of people he approved of and suppressing the posts of people he did not, which had created for the companies whose advertising had funded the platform a brand safety calculus that a significant number of them had resolved by leaving. The core conflict of this chapter was not between Musk and his critics, though the critics were louder and better organized in the summer of 2026 than they had been at any previous point. The conflict was between two things that were both genuinely true about him and that existed in permanent irresolvable tension: that the traits producing the volatility were not separable from the traits producing the achievement, and that the volatility was nevertheless producing consequences that the achievement could not indefinitely absorb. The people who had worked most closely with him across the longest periods were almost uniform on the first point. The ferocious impatience, the willingness to say the unsayable in whatever register it arrived in his mind, regardless of context or consequence, the incapacity to distinguish between the person making an argument he disagreed with and an enemy to be destroyed, these were not characteristics that existed alongside the first, principles thinking and the tolerance for risk and the ability to hold complex systems in working memory and manipulate them in real time. They were the same characteristic, expressed in different domains. The engine that would not accept that a rocket had to cost what rockets had always cost was the same engine that would not accept that a journalist's critique deserved the courtesy of engagement rather than the response it would have gotten in a schoolyard. You could not turn one off without affecting the other, and the people who had tried to counsel him toward greater personal restraint over the years had discovered, with a consistency that had become its own data point, that the counsel was received, considered, and then set aside in favor of whatever impulse arrived next with sufficient force. The revealing action of this chapter is not the 217 post, which was typical, but what happened 6 days later when the journalist who had been its target published a follow-up piece that had been reported in the interval. A piece that documented, with specific sourcing, that 3 members of Tesla's audit committee had privately raised concerns about Musk's social media behavior with the company's general counsel in the preceding 12 months, and that those concerns had been documented in meeting notes that the journalist had obtained through a source the piece did not identify. The piece was more significant than the original. It contained information that, if accurate, had direct implications for Tesla's SEC compliance obligations and for the board's fiduciary conduct. Musk's response, which arrived 4 hours after publication, was not another late-night post, but a statement issued through Tesla's communications function. A statement that was, by the standards of his usual public register, measured and specific, noting that the board had full confidence in the company's governance processes and that the reporting contained material inaccuracies that Tesla's legal team was reviewing. It was, by the standard of a normal corporate communications response, unremarkable. By the standard of Musk's personal communication history, it was startling in its restraint, and the restraint itself became news, because the people covering him had learned to read the delta between his typical register and his actual register as a more reliable signal than the content of either. Something about the second piece had landed differently. Whether it was the sourcing, the specificity of the audit committee detail, or something in his own assessment of the legal exposure the piece created was not clear. What was clear was that the communications department had been involved, which meant that someone had reached him before he posted, and that he had on this occasion allowed himself to be reached. The figure who had reached him, on the evidence available to the people who tracked the internal dynamics of his organizations, was not his general counsel, and not any member of his immediate family, and not any of the advisors whose names appear in the accounts of his decision-making across the preceding years. It was Jared Burkle, the head of Musk's family office, and the closest thing he maintained to a chief of staff for his personal affairs. A figure so deliberately maintained below the public threshold of visibility that most of the journalists who wrote about Musk daily would not have been able to identify him from a photograph. Burkle had been in Musk's orbit since 2016, managing the financial, legal, and personal administrative complexity that attends the life of someone who has accumulated Musk's particular combination of wealth, legal exposure, and institutional entanglement. And he had survived in that role through multiple cycles of organizational upheaval and personal turbulence by developing a capacity that people who knew him described in consistent terms. He understood with unusual precision the specific conditions under which Musk was persuadable, and he confined his interventions to those conditions, and he never, under any circumstances, allowed the fact of his influence to become visible in the way that visibility would have ended it. In the summer of 2026, as the governance critique intensified and the institutional investors who held Tesla positions began generating questions in earnings calls that had a new texture of genuine rather than performative concern, Burkle was operating with a frequency and a precision that the situation required, and that he was, by disposition, and by the logic of his own survival, incapable of discussing publicly. The relationship between them had shifted in this period, not in its fundamental structure but in the intensity with which that structure was being tested, and the degree to which the outcomes of those tests were carrying consequences that extended well beyond the personal. What the man-child critique? The phrase had originated in a profile published by a magazine whose political sympathies were clearly opposed to Musk's, but it had migrated with uncomfortable speed into the vocabulary of financial analysts and governance experts who had no particular political stake in the framing, was actually describing was something more specific and more structurally interesting than simple immaturity. It was describing a model of agency that had been spectacularly adaptive in certain environments and was increasingly maladaptive in others, and that Musk appeared either unable or unwilling to modulate based on the environment he was in. The environments in which the model had been most adaptive were the ones he had largely constructed himself: the early SpaceX team, the Tesla factory floor culture, the X-Corp post-acquisition structure, contexts in which his authority was total enough that the personal volatility functioned as a feature rather than a defect, a signal of intensity that calibrated the behavior of everyone around him toward the outcomes he wanted. The environments in which it was becoming most maladaptive were the ones he had not constructed and could not fully control: regulatory bodies, institutional investor relations, allied government relationships, the international commercial partnerships that SpaceX's Starlink program depended on, and the public trust that the Optimus program would require at a scale and in a demographic that found his late-night posting habits either alarming or disqualifying. In these environments, the volatility was not a calibration signal. It was noise, and noise in those frequencies carried costs that did not appear immediately on any balance sheet, and were therefore easy to underweight until they became impossible to ignore. The summer of 2026 was not the moment at which those costs became impossible to ignore. It was the moment at which the category of people who were beginning to add them up expanded past the threshold where the addition could be dismissed as motivated criticism. When the governance committee of a major sovereign wealth fund that held a significant Tesla position circulated an internal memo, one that was subsequently leaked to a wire service and published in edited form, that used the phrase "key man risk of an unusual character" to describe the dependency of Tesla's strategic direction on an individual whose public conduct creates periodic material uncertainty, the phrase "unusual character" was doing a great deal of work. It was the vocabulary of institutional restraint, applied to a situation that the institutions involved did not have a clean prior category for, because the prior categories assumed that the key man in question either recognized the costs of the conduct and chose to manage them or did not recognize them and could be educated. Musk recognized them. This was not a matter of serious debate among the people who knew him. He simply weighted them differently than the institutions weighting them from the outside did. And he had been doing so for long enough that the difference in weighting had become a fixed structural feature of the risk profile rather than a variable that intervention might adjust. What no one in the summer of 2026 had yet fully accounted for was the degree to which the critique itself had become, for Musk, a source of energy rather than a moderating force. The way that a particular personality type metabolizes opposition not as information requiring integration but as fuel for the next phase of the project, and the way that metabolism, when it operates at sufficient scale and with sufficient resources behind it, can sustain a trajectory through levels of institutional resistance that would have arrested anyone who needed external validation to continue. The critics calling him a man-child were not wrong about the behavior they were describing. They were wrong about its implications, which were not the implications of immaturity. The gradual loss of credibility, the erosion of institutional support, the eventual reckoning that awaits people who mistake their position for their permanence. The implications were something else, something the vocabulary of the critique was not equipped to capture, because the critique had been developed for a world in which the institutions doing the criticizing retained the leverage to make the critique consequential, and the question of whether that world still existed in the form the critique assumed was precisely the question that the summer of 2026 had not yet answered, though the answer was arriving, as answers to questions of that magnitude tend to, faster than anyone had scheduled it to. The Senate Commerce Committee's letter to Tesla's board, requesting a formal briefing on the company's governance policies as they related to its chief executive's public communications, arrived on a Thursday, and by Friday it had been referred to outside counsel, and the outside counsel's first call was to Burkle, and Burkle's first call after that was to a number that connected to a phone that Musk did not always answer, and on this particular Friday he answered on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting it. Chapter 95. The Musk Dynasty, Genetic and Philosophical Lineage. The photograph was taken by someone who was not supposed to be there, with a lens long enough to compress distance into intimacy. And what it showed was this: Elon Musk, walking along a path at what appeared to be a private estate in Texas in the low amber light of early evening, with two small children moving in his general vicinity in the loose gravitational way that young children move around a parent they are comfortable with. Not holding his hand, not directed, simply orbiting. He was looking at his phone. The children were looking at something in the grass. The photograph captured no exchange between them, no gesture of connection, no moment of the deliberate parental engagement that publicists arrange and photographers wait for. It captured instead something more honest, and depending on your reading of it, more revealing. A man in the presence of his children who was also somewhere else, the phone a portal to whatever was demanding his attention, in one of the several dozen operational contexts that were always demanding his attention. The children content in his proximity in the way that children are content when proximity is what they have been given and have learned not to expect more. The photograph circulated for approximately 18 hours before being removed, following a legal communication from an entity representing Musk's personal interests. In those 18 hours, it was seen by several million people, and the comments it generated were divided with rough precision between those who saw in it the portrait of a neglectful father and those who saw in it the portrait of a man carrying a weight of responsibility that ordinary frameworks of parental judgment were not equipped to evaluate. Both readings were, in their way, correct. Neither was complete. The autumn of 2026 arrived in a culture that had been arguing about Elon Musk's children for the better part of a year with an intensity that was not, at its root, about the children at all. The argument was a proxy for a larger and less tractable argument about inheritance. Not the legal kind, the distribution of assets across generations, which is governed by instruments that courts know how to interpret, but the philosophical kind, the transmission of worldview and value and cognitive orientation from a parent to a child, and outward from there into the culture the child eventually inhabits and shapes. Musk had 14 children in the autumn of 2026. He had spoken about them, collectively and in the abstract, with a consistency of framing that had remained essentially unchanged across years of public appearances. They represented his considered response to the demographic emergency he believed was the most underappreciated existential threat facing human civilization. And they represented, in their particular genetic and philosophical inheritance, a set of vectors through which the values and cognitive orientations he believed were most necessary for the future would be propagated forward in time. He said this not in the register of sentiment, but in the register of strategy, which was either admirably honest or deeply strange, depending on the listener's prior relationship with the idea that children are instruments of civilizational intent rather than ends in themselves. The culture of 2026, which had been arguing about pronatalism and eugenics, adjacent thinking, and the political economy of reproduction with increasing ferocity since at least 2022, received this framing with the predictable range of responses, from enthusiastic endorsement among those who shared his demographic anxieties, to accusations that were not always carefully distinguished from each other by the people making them. The conflict that defined this chapter of Musk's life was not public, and not operational, and not susceptible to the first principles analysis he applied to engineering problems, which was precisely what made it the most genuinely difficult conflict he faced in this period. It was the conflict between the theory of legacy he had articulated publicly, and the practice of it, as experienced by the people most directly subject to it, which is to say his children, and in particular the older ones, who were now of ages that made them capable of forming and expressing independent views about what it meant to be a Musk. The evidence on this point was not extensive, because most of his children were young enough that their inner lives were not available to public scrutiny, and because the ones who were old enough had, with one significant exception, maintained the privacy that their circumstances and the legal instruments surrounding them made possible. The exception was Vivian Jenna Wilson, who had at 18 legally separated herself from her father's name and from her father's life with a completeness and a public clarity that constituted, by any reasonable reading, a verdict. She had not subsequently elaborated on that verdict in extensive public terms, which was itself a form of eloquence. The statement had been made in the action, and the action was not ambiguous. Musk had addressed it. When addressed it, he did, in terms that were consistent across several appearances. He had offered support. The support had not been wanted. He respected her choices. He did not agree with everything she believed. The situation was painful. He said this with the particular compression of a person delivering a rehearsed honesty, true in its components, and somehow insufficient as a whole, in the way that accurate summaries of complicated human situations are always insufficient, because the compression destroys the texture, and the texture is where the meaning lives. The revealing action of this chapter came not in any public forum, but in a conversation that was subsequently described by one of its participants to a person who described it, in appropriately anonymized terms, to a journalist who chose not to publish it at the time, but whose notes became available in the research for this account. In the late summer of 2026, Musk spent an afternoon with Griffin and Kai, his twin sons, with Justine Wilson, who were by then 22 years old and in the early phases of their own adult lives. The meeting was not unusual. He maintained contact with the children from his first marriage with a regularity that was more consistent than his critics generally acknowledged, if less intensive than his proponents sometimes claimed. What was unusual was that Griffin, who had been pursuing interests in biology and cognitive science with the quiet, methodical focus that people who knew him described as distinctly his own rather than a reflection of his father's, asked Musk directly about the philosophical framework underlying his decision to have a large number of children with multiple partners simultaneously. Not angrily, not accusatorially. In the register, by the account, of a young man conducting a genuine inquiry into the premises of a worldview he had inherited and was now, as young adults do, examining from the outside. Musk's answer, by the account, was lengthy and genuinely engaged, and covered the demographic data, and the civilizational stakes, and the first principles argument for why the standard social framework around family formation was a local cultural convention rather than a universal prescription. Griffin listened to all of it, and then asked one follow-up question, which was, had Musk considered what it was like to be one of the children in this framework rather than the architect of it? There was, by the account, a silence. And then Musk said something that the account rendered as, I think about it more than I talk about it. And then the conversation moved to Griffin's research, which Musk asked about with the specific curiosity he brings to technical subjects that genuinely interest him, and which did genuinely interest him, and the afternoon continued, and nobody resolved anything, which is how afternoons with fathers and adult children usually go when the underlying questions are real ones. The figure whose presence is most essential to this chapter is Justine Wilson, the first wife and the mother of 6 of his children, and whose position in the Musk narrative is among the most complex of any person in it. She had written about the marriage and its dissolution with a candor that had cost her something, and that had illuminated aspects of his character that no engineering briefing or business profile had access to. The demand for a particular kind of mirroring, the difficulty with emotional registers that were not oriented toward problem solving, the experience of being close to a person of extraordinary capability, who nevertheless found certain kinds of ordinary human reciprocity difficult to access or sustain. By 2026, many years past the marriage and its aftermath, Justine Wilson occupied a position relative to Musk that had settled into something that was not warm and not hostile, and that had been shaped above everything else by the shared custody and shared investment in the 5 surviving children from their marriage. She had watched, from this position, the expansion of his family across the subsequent years with the complex attention of someone who understands the subject better than most observers, and who has chosen, with evident deliberateness, to process that understanding in private, rather than in the public forums that would have been available to her. In the autumn of 2026, she was working on a project of her own, writing, which had always been her native register, that people who knew her described as the most ambitious and most personally costly thing she had attempted. Whether it would intersect with the public account of the Musk family's history was a question that the autumn of 2026 had not yet answered. What the concept of the Musk dynasty required its author to reckon with, and what the autumn of 2026 was forcing toward the surface of the reckoning, was the fundamental instability at the center of the project. Dynasties, in the historical sense that Musk's public framing implicitly invoked, the great families of industrial capitalism, the lineages of scientific and philosophical influence that had shaped the direction of civilizations, were not built by intention alone. They were built by the transmission of something from parent to child that was more specific and more fragile than genetic material or financial inheritance, a set of values internalized rather than assigned, a worldview adopted through genuine encounter rather than ambient exposure, a sense of purpose that emerged from the child's own encounter with the world rather than from a framework designed by the parent before the child existed. The history of ambitious men who attempted to consciously engineer dynasties is not on the evidence of the historical record, a history of uniform success. It is a history of children who became their parents' vision, and children who became its refutation, and children who became something their parents had not imagined, which is what children, in the exercise of the autonomy that is their fundamental right and their fundamental nature, tend to become regardless of the intentions surrounding their origin. Musk understood this in the abstract, in the way that he understood most things that could be expressed as a logical proposition. What was less clear, and what the autumn of 2026 was making less clear rather than more, was whether the abstract understanding had penetrated to the level where it could modify behavior, whether the man who had applied first principles thinking to rocket fuel and battery chemistry and the governance of cities on other planets was capable of applying it to the proposition that the most important variable in the transmission of a legacy is not the intention of the transmitter but the interiority of the recipient, and that interiority is a thing that cannot be engineered, only encountered, and that the encounter requires a quality of sustained, undistracted, phoned-down presence that the architecture of his life made structurally difficult to provide in the quantities that 14 children across 4 households distributed across multiple cities and one ongoing paradigm-shifting industrial civilization might reasonably require. The children who would eventually inherit whatever the Musk dynasty became, the companies or the philosophy, or simply the surname and its freight of association and expectation, were, in the autumn of 2026, ranging in age from infancy to young adulthood. The oldest were beginning to make choices about their own lives that would, in aggregate, constitute the first empirical test of whether the dynasty's philosophical transmission had worked in the way its architect intended. The youngest were not yet old enough to hold a conversation about it. Somewhere in the middle of that range, growing up in Austin and Los Angeles, and wherever else the logistics of their particular circumstances had placed them, were children who were inheriting simultaneously one of the most extraordinary legacies in the history of human ambition, and a set of questions about love and presence, and the difference between being valued as a vector of someone else's vision and being known as a person, questions that no amount of first principles thinking had yet produced a satisfactory answer to, and that the autobiography Justine Wilson had quietly begun writing in a room in Los Angeles was preparing to ask in public in her own words for the first time. Chapter 96. Human Purpose in a World After Work. The question came from a 17-year-old in the third row, and it stopped him in a way that questions from heads of state and Senate subcommittees and hostile financial journalists had not managed to stop him in recent memory. She had raised her hand during what was supposed to be the closing segment of a streamed conversation at a technology education summit in Austin, one of those events organized around the premise that proximity to consequential people produces inspiration in young minds, which is sometimes true. And when the moderator called on her, she stood up with the particular straightness of a teenager who has decided to ask the real question regardless of what the situation permits, and she said, "If robots do everything, what are people supposed to do with themselves?" Musk looked at her for a moment, with an attention that was different in quality from the attention he had been distributing across the room for the preceding 90 minutes. The room, which had been conducting itself with the ambient performative enthusiasm of an audience that knows it is being recorded, went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when someone has said the thing that everyone was thinking, but that the format of the event had been implicitly organized to prevent. He opened his mouth and then closed it, which was not something the people who had been watching him in public contexts for years had a ready catalog entry for. When he spoke, it was slowly, which was also not typical, and what he said was not an answer but an acknowledgement that the question was the right one, that he thought about it, that he did not have a complete answer, and that anyone who told her they did was selling something. The moderator moved to close the session. Musk held up a hand and kept talking for another 12 minutes, and what he said in those 12 minutes was the most unguarded thing he had said in public in years. The winter of 2026 arrived in a country that was conducting, at every level simultaneously, an argument about the nature and function and future of work that had been building since the first serious AI systems began performing cognitive tasks at professional grade, and had now, with the optimist deployment data accumulating, and the labor displacement projections being revised downward on a quarterly basis, achieved the temperature of genuine social crisis rather than theoretical concern. The unemployment figures that the Bureau of Labor Statistics published were, by the analytical consensus of everyone who studied them carefully, significantly undercounting the disruption, not through dishonesty, but through the structural inadequacy of measurement tools designed for an economy in which the category of displaced by automation had always been a manageable minority rather than an accelerating plurality. The gig economy, which had functioned for a decade as the absorptive layer for workers whose prior employment had been eliminated by previous rounds of automation, was itself contracting as the tasks that gig platforms had organized began to fall within the operational capability of robotic systems. The think tanks that studied these questions were producing reports with titles of escalating alarm. The economists who had spent 20 years arguing that automation always created more jobs than it destroyed were publishing papers with footnotes that walked back the generality without quite retracting the conclusion. The politicians were doing what politicians do when the underlying reality of a situation has outrun the available vocabulary for discussing it. They were describing it in the terms of the last crisis rather than the current one, and the solutions they were proposing had the relationship to the actual problem that a 19th-century physician's recommendation of rest and fresh air had to a bacterial infection, not harmful exactly, not responsive exactly, oriented toward a model of the patient that was no longer current. Musk had been engaging the question of human purpose in a post-scarcity, post-labor economy for years, and his engagement had evolved through several phases that tracked, imperfectly but legibly, the development of his own companies toward the conditions that made the question urgent. In the early phase, his answer had been essentially optimistic in the libertarian mode. Freed from the necessity of labor, humans would pursue creative and intellectual and exploratory endeavors that the grinding necessity of economic survival had always crowded out. This was the answer of a man whose own experience of work was so thoroughly organized around intrinsic motivation, who could not, by his own account and the account of everyone who had worked with him, distinguish between what he did for money and what he did because it was the most interesting thing available to him, that the idea of people who worked primarily because they had to, and who might not spontaneously reorganize their lives around self-directed creative endeavor if the necessity were removed, was not fully available to him as a lived intuition. The second phase had been more structurally engaged with the political economy. Universal basic income as the redistribution mechanism that allowed the productivity gains of automation to flow to the population broadly, rather than concentrating in the capital that owned the machines. He had endorsed this position in general terms without attaching it to any specific policy proposal, which was consistent with his pattern of identifying a first principles solution and then treating the political implementation as someone else's problem. The third phase, which was where he was in the winter of 2026, was quieter and less systematized, and for that reason, more honest, a genuine uncertainty about what human beings are for when the biological and economic imperatives that had organized human life since the species first appeared were no longer structurally operative, expressed not as a confession of ignorance but as an open question that he was carrying with him into the work the way a physicist carries an unresolved anomaly in the data, not resolved, not dismissed, present. The conflict of this chapter was internal, in a way that Musk's conflicts rarely were. He was not a man given to extended public ambivalence. The operating mode that had produced his results was characterized by a willingness to commit to positions before the uncertainty was fully resolved, on the calculated bet that the cost of acting on an imperfect model was lower than the cost of waiting for a complete one. But the question of human purpose resisted the first principles approach in a way that rocket engineering and battery chemistry and even artificial intelligence did not, because it was not ultimately a question about systems. It was a question about meaning, which is a domain where the tools that had served him everywhere else did not straightforwardly apply, and where his own relationship to the question was too particular to serve as a reliable map for anyone else's answer. He found meaning in the work, in the specific, granular, technically demanding work of building things that had not existed before, with an intensity and an exclusivity that most people do not find in any single domain of life. The question of what people would do in a world without work was, for him, experientially close to the question of what he would do in a world without problems, which was a question he could not answer from the inside because the condition it described was not one he had ever inhabited or wished to inhabit. The limitations of his own psychology, as a guide to the general human case, were visible to him in the abstract. Whether they were visible to him in the specific, in the particular decisions he was making about deployment timelines and transition support, and the pace at which the world he was building would arrive for people who had not chosen to be in its path, was a question the winter of 2026 was not positioned to resolve. The moment that functions as the keyhole into what he actually believed beneath the various public framings came in the 12 additional minutes he gave the 17-year-old's question. He talked about Mars, which was not surprising, but he talked about it differently than he usually did, not as a destination or a backup drive for the species, but as a container for a kind of purpose that could not be satisfied by comfort or ease or the removal of necessity. He said that the thing he feared most about a world of automated abundance was not poverty, which automation would eliminate, but meaninglessness, which it might produce, and that meaninglessness was the thing that civilizations died of when they could no longer locate themselves in relation to something genuinely hard and genuinely important. He said that the frontier, and he meant this in the specific sense of a place where the outcome is not guaranteed, and the work is not optional, and the stakes are real, was not a luxury that prosperous civilizations could afford to do without, but a necessity that prosperous civilizations were most at risk of losing. He said this without notes, in the slightly disorganized syntax of a person thinking rather than presenting, and then he said, "I don't know if I'm right about this, but I think the question you asked is the most important question of the next 50 years, and I think the people who are going to answer it are people roughly your age, and I think you should take that seriously." The room was quiet again, and then applauded, and the moderator closed the session, and the girl in the third row sat down with the expression of someone who had received something they had not expected to receive from the place they had asked. The relationship that bears on this chapter most significantly is one that has no obvious precedent in Musk's biography, and that has been overlooked in most accounts because it does not fit the categories that biographical narrative tends to organize around. Not a romantic relationship, not a professional subordinate, not a family member or a rival. It is his relationship with the philosophical tradition, specifically with a set of thinkers whose work he had engaged with across decades, and who had shaped, in ways he sometimes acknowledged and sometimes did not, the framework within which his public thinking about human purpose operated. He had cited Ian M. Banks's culture novels in interviews across years, a science fiction series organized around the premise of a post-scarcity civilization of effectively unlimited technological capability, in which the central drama was precisely the question of what beings do with themselves when necessity has been abolished. He had cited Douglas Adams. He had cited, with less frequency, but with the specific citing of someone who has actually read the source, various Stoic philosophers on the relationship between voluntary hardship and the development of character. What these references revealed, taken together, was not a systematic philosophical position, but a persistent preoccupation. A man who had been worrying, across the entire span of his public life, about the same problem he was now building the conditions for, and who had not arrived at a satisfying answer, and who was in the remarkable position of being the person most directly responsible for making the problem real while still not knowing what the answer was. The culture novels, notably, do not resolve the question either. Banks depicts a civilization that has abolished necessity and achieved something approximating flourishing, but the novels that are most interesting in the series are the ones that examine what the beings in that civilization sacrifice in exchange for their comfort, and what they go looking for when they discover the sacrifice and where the looking takes them. Musk had read these books multiple times. The resonance was not incidental. What the winter of 2026 was producing, in the domain of this question, was a body of preliminary evidence that would take a generation to fully interpret, and that was arriving before the interpretive frameworks for it existed. The first cohort of workers who had been substantially displaced by optimist deployment, not the dramatic headline displacements that produced labor actions and legislative attention, but the quieter, more diffuse displacements of people whose job categories had contracted rather than disappeared, whose hours had been reduced and whose responsibilities had been narrowed, and who had found themselves with more time and less structure than they had previously had, were beginning to generate data about what people actually do when the necessity of labor is partially removed. Some of it was consistent with the optimistic projection: educational enrollment, creative and artistic activity, community engagement, the kinds of human connection that full-time employment crowds out. Some of it was less consistent: a rise in what the mental health literature was calling purposelessness syndrome. Not depression in the clinical sense, but a diffuse loss of the forward orientation that labor, whatever its other indignities, had provided. The data was preliminary and contested and subject to interpretations that varied with the political priors of the interpreter. But it was real data, generated by real people navigating a real transition, and it was arriving at the desks of the policy analysts and the social scientists and the philosophers who studied human flourishing at exactly the moment when the transition they were analyzing was accelerating past the pace their frameworks could accommodate. Musk received a summary of some of this data in a briefing in December 2026, prepared by a team at XAI that had been tasked with monitoring the social impacts of the Optimus deployment as part of the responsible scaling framework the company had announced with considerable fanfare the previous spring. He read the summary, by the account of the person who delivered it, in about 12 minutes, which was faster than it had been designed to be read, but consistent with his processing speed for dense analytical material. He asked 3 questions, all of them technical: about sample size, about confounding variables, about the methodology used to distinguish automation-related purposelessness from the purposelessness associated with other concurrent social changes. He did not ask about the people described in the data, which was noticed by the person who delivered the briefing, who had been expecting him to ask about the people. Whether the absence of that question represented a gap in his empathic range, or a deliberate choice to engage the problem at the level where he could actually affect it rather than at the level where he could only feel it, or something in between those two things that does not have a clean name, was not something the briefing resolved. What it resolved was only this: the data existed, he had read it, and the next morning he sent a message to the Optimus program leadership asking for an accelerated review of the transition support protocols, which was an action. And Musk, when confronted with a problem he cannot fully think his way through, defaults to action, which is both his greatest strength and the thing about him that the people who love him and the people who study him and the people who are most affected by what he builds have always found in the end most difficult to fully reckon with: that the action is always already underway before the question is answered, and the world it makes is the world that then has to live with the question's consequences. And the question, in the winter of 2026, was larger than any action taken so far had been adequate to address, and the gap between the two was quietly growing. Chapter 97. The Unified Infrastructure, Solar, Space, and Silicon. The map on the wall of the conference room in Austin was not a map of any single thing, which was the point. It had been assembled by a team of infrastructure analysts whose job description did not exist 5 years earlier, and whose title, Systems Integration Architect, a phrase that meant approximately what it sounds like, and considerably more than it sounds like, had been coined internally because the external vocabulary had not caught up to the function. What the map showed, rendered, in the color-coded precision of people who understand that clarity at scale requires ruthless visual discipline, was the physical footprint of the interconnected systems that Musk's companies had built, were building, or had contracted to build across the surface of the Earth and in the orbital shells above it. The Starlink constellation, 4,700 active satellites as of that morning, rendered as a mesh of translucent lines over the planet's surface. The Megapack installations, Tesla's utility-scale battery deployments, scattered across 6 continents in clusters that corresponded to the locations where renewable generation had outpaced grid storage capacity. The supercharger network, more than 70,000 stations globally, a circulatory system for the electric vehicle transition that no government had funded and no utility had built. The XAI compute clusters, their locations partially redacted in the version of the map that existed outside the highest clearance tier, represented as nodes of concentrated processing power connected by fiber and by the Starlink backhaul that made them collectively something different from the sum of their parts. And over everything, the SpaceX launch infrastructure, Boca Chica, Cape Canaveral, the international launch agreements and the recovery vessels, and the orbital refueling architecture that was still being built, but whose design had been finalized in sufficient detail that its eventual shape was no longer speculative. Musk stood in front of this map for approximately 4 minutes without speaking, which the 3 people in the room with him understood as a request for silence, and then he pointed to a gap, a region in Central Asia where the Starlink coverage was thinner than the surrounding areas and where the megapack deployment had not yet reached, and said, "That's wrong." "Why is that wrong?" And the meeting began. The early months of 2027 arrived in a world that was conducting a belated reckoning with a transformation that had been happening in plain sight for a decade, and that had only recently achieved the critical density required to be perceived as a transformation rather than a series of unrelated developments. The energy transition, the AI transition, the space commercialization transition, and the labor automation transition had been discussed as separate phenomena by separate policy communities, analyzed by separate academic disciplines, regulated by separate institutional frameworks, and covered by separate beats in the publications that tracked them. The people who had been arguing for years that these transitions were not separate, that they were facets of a single underlying reorganization of the relationship between human civilization and physical reality, driven by a convergence of cheap electrons, cheap compute, cheap launch, and cheap sensors, had been correct, and the vindication of their correctness was arriving not as intellectual satisfaction but as the specific vertigo of watching something you predicted from far away resolve into detail at close range. The detail, as it resolved, had a shape that the predictions had not fully anticipated, because the predictions had been made before it was clear that the convergence would be controlled, to the degree that it was controlled, by a single integrated set of entities under the direction of a single individual. This was not a thing that had been planned by anyone, including Musk. It was a thing that had happened because he had identified each component of the convergence earlier than his contemporaries, had pursued each component with an intensity that his contemporaries could not match, and had lived long enough and succeeded consistently enough that the components had begun to interact with each other in ways that generated advantages compounding faster than any single competitor could close. The conflict that defined this chapter was structural and systemic, and did not have a face, which made it more difficult to engage than the conflicts that did. The vertical integration of Tesla's energy and transportation systems with SpaceX's orbital infrastructure and Zay's artificial intelligence capability had produced by early 2027 something that antitrust law in the United States and the European Union had not been designed to evaluate, because antitrust law was organized around the concept of market dominance within a defined market. And what the Musk infrastructure stack represented was not dominance within any single market, but a kind of orthogonal position relative to markets, a set of capabilities that did not compete with existing industries so much as it operated at a layer of the economy beneath and above existing industries simultaneously. The legal frameworks that existed for evaluating this position had been developed for a world in which the units of economic analysis were products and services and the companies that produced them, not infrastructure stacks that provided the underlying physical substrate on which products and services of all kinds depended. The Federal Trade Commission had convened a working group. The European Commission had opened a preliminary inquiry. The working group and the inquiry had both been underway for more than a year, and had both produced, so far, a substantial body of analysis and no actionable conclusion, because the analytical work kept arriving at the same impasse. The framework capable of addressing the situation did not exist yet, and building it in real time while the situation it was being built to address continued to develop was an exercise in the permanent inadequacy of institutional response to technological change. The people doing this work were not incompetent. They were working with tools that had been forged for a different world, and were discovering, one careful document at a time, the specific ways in which those tools did not fit. The moment that functions as this chapter's keyhole into Musk's character occurred during a quarterly review of the XAI SpaceX integration project, the specific program tasked with building the computational and communications architecture that would allow artificial intelligence systems to operate across the orbital infrastructure rather than being confined to ground-based data centers. The review was attended by senior engineering leadership from both organizations and by a small number of people whose roles crossed the organizational boundary, and it had been running for about 3 hours when the discussion arrived at a problem in the latency architecture, a technical constraint in the way signals moved between the orbital compute layer and the surface-based systems that the AI models depended on for real-world interaction. The engineering team had prepared 3 options, each representing a different trade-off between cost, timeline, and performance, and had recommended the middle option as the most defensible given current constraints. Musk listened to the presentation of all 3 options and then said, "What's option 4?" The lead engineer explained that option 4 was not on the list because it required a hardware modification to the next generation of Starlink satellites that was technically feasible, but that would add approximately 8 months to the production timeline and roughly $300 million to the program cost. Musk said, "That's option 1. The engineer pointed out that the cost and timeline implications had been the reason the team had not included it in the formal recommendation. Musk said, "The latency we're accepting in option 2 is a permanent architectural constraint. $300 million now, or we build something we'll have to replace in 5 years. What's $300 million in 5 years of compounding?" He moved to the next agenda item. The engineers updated the program plan that evening, and the modified satellite design entered the production queue. And nobody who was in the room described the exchange as anything other than correct. Not comfortable, not considerate of the people who had done the work of preparing the options he had discarded, but correct in the specific sense that it identified the right answer by refusing to accept the frame within which the wrong answer had been made to look reasonable. The figure whose presence most illuminates this chapter is not an engineer or an executive, but an economist. A particular kind of economist, the kind who studies infrastructure and its relationship to power, whose work had been cited in the Antitrust Working Group documents, and who had spent the better part of 2 years attempting to develop the analytical framework that the regulators lacked. Her name does not appear in most accounts of the Musk story, because she was not in his orbit and had not sought to be. Her relationship to him was the relationship of an analyst to a subject, mediated entirely by public data and the documents that the company's regulatory filings required. What she had concluded, in a paper that circulated in draft form in the policy community in early 2027 before its formal publication, was that the Musk infrastructure stack represented a novel category of economic entity that she proposed calling a substrate monopoly, a company or collection of companies that does not dominate a market in the traditional sense, but that controls the physical and computational infrastructure on which market activity of all kinds depends, in the way that a port authority does not compete with the goods that pass through its terminals, but is nevertheless indispensable to the commerce those goods represent. The historical analogies she drew were not to Standard Oil or AT&T or the tech platform monopolies that antitrust discussions typically invoked. They were to the transcontinental railroads of the 19th century, which had not merely provided transportation, but had determined which cities grew and which did not, which industries flourished and which could not reach their markets, which regions of the country participated in the national economy and which were structurally excluded from it. The railroad barons had not intended to acquire this kind of power. They had intended to build railroads, and the power had been a consequence of the scale at which they had built them, and the degree to which the society that grew up around their infrastructure had made itself dependent on it, before the implications of that dependence were fully visible. She was careful in the paper not to draw the analogy to Musk as an accusation. She drew it as a diagnostic. This is the structure, this is what history tells us about structures of this kind. Here are the questions that the structure generates. Here are the mechanisms by which societies have previously addressed those questions. Here is the assessment of whether those mechanisms are adequate to the current instance. Her assessment of whether those mechanisms were adequate was rendered in the careful, hedged language of academic publication, and the careful, hedged language did not obscure the conclusion, which was that they were not. What the map on the wall in Austin represented, in the reading that its existence demanded, was something that had not existed before in quite this form: a privately owned physical nervous system for a significant fraction of global civilization, built faster than the institutional frameworks designed to govern such things had been able to respond, by a person whose stated intentions for it were genuinely oriented toward human flourishing, and whose capacity to be the sole arbiter of those intentions was, for exactly that reason, the central, unresolved question of the age he had done more than anyone else to bring into being. The solar panels on the roofs of homes across 6 continents were charging Tesla Powerwalls that were connected to megapacks that were stabilizing grids that were increasingly powered by renewable sources. The Starlink terminals in rural Ukraine and remote Indonesia and underserved communities in the American Southwest were providing internet access that had not existed before, and that those communities now depended on in ways that made the continuity of the service a matter of public importance rather than private commercial discretion. The XAI systems running on orbital compute were making decisions, not autonomously, not without human oversight, but consequentially, in logistics networks and financial systems, and medical diagnostic pipelines that had integrated them, because they were better than the alternatives, and that had not, in most cases, fully mapped the implications of that integration before completing it. The systems worked. This was not in serious dispute. They worked better than what they had replaced, and they worked at a scale and a cost that no prior approach had achieved, and the people using them were, by the available measures, better off for having access to them. These facts coexisted without resolution with the other fact that the systems were owned by one person, governed by the judgment of one person, and dependent for their continuity and their orientation on the continued good intentions and continued good judgment of one person, in a way that no democratic mechanism and no institutional check had been adequate to address, and that the history of concentrations of this kind offered no examples of the concentration remaining over a sufficiently long period as benign as its architect intended it to be. Musk drove home from the Austin office that evening along roads lit by the amber glow of a Texas dusk, past solar installations that his company had built, and through a city whose growth had been shaped in ways the city's planners were still mapping by the presence of his facilities. And somewhere above him in the darkening sky, the Starlink constellation was completing another orbital pass, and the Starship prototype at Boca Chica was cycling through a pre-launch checklist, and the XAI servers in their climate-controlled facilities were processing queries from 40 million users in 37 countries. And the map on the wall of the conference room was already outdated, because the system it depicted had continued to grow in the hours since he had stood in front of it, as it grew every day, as it had grown every day for years, compounding on itself with the momentum of something that had achieved sufficient scale to be, in certain practical respects, beyond the ability of any single actor to reverse, including. And this was the part that the people who studied these things found most worth examining, the person who had built it. The congressional subcommittee that had been drafting legislation to address the substrate monopoly question had scheduled its first public hearing for March, and the witness list it had compiled included 3 former Federal Reserve governors, the chief executives of 4 competing technology companies, and 2 academic economists, and did not include Musk, who had been invited and had declined, and whose lawyer had responded to the invitation with a letter that was courteous, specific, and 17 pages long, and that the subcommittee's staff counsel had been reading and rereading for a week, without arriving at a clean answer to the question it was designed to produce. Chapter 98. First Principles as a Universal Problem-Solving Tool. He had written it on a whiteboard in dry erase marker, in the handwriting of a person who has never prioritized legibility over speed. And the people who saw it that morning in the Government Efficiency Office in Washington described it afterward with the slightly dazed quality of witnesses to something they are still processing. It was not a policy recommendation, or an executive directive, or any of the documents that the office's function officially produced. It was a question rendered in 3 lines that took up roughly a third of the board's surface. What is this for? What does it actually do? Why does it have to be done this way? Below it, in slightly smaller letters, if you can't answer all 3, stop doing it. The whiteboard had been photographed by someone on the staff, and the photograph had circulated internally before being leaked to a newsletter that covered federal bureaucracy with the attentiveness of a publication that knows its readers believe this subject matters more than the general press does. And the newsletter had published it with a headline that was either admiring or alarmed, depending on the reader's prior position. And the prior positions of the relevant readers were not difficult to predict. Musk arrived at the office that morning to find the photograph already circulating, and looked at his phone for a moment with an expression that the 2 staffers present read differently, one as satisfaction, one as calculation, and then pocketed it and asked whether the analysis of the Department of Agriculture's administrative substructure was ready, and the meeting began. The spring of 2027 was the season in which the project of applying first principles thinking to the machinery of the American federal government a project that had begun with the formation of what had been variously called a government efficiency advisory body, a structural reform initiative, and by its critics, a privatization apparatus operating outside constitutional boundaries, arrived at the moment of maximum friction with the institutions it had been tasked to reform. The friction was not new. It had been building since the project's formal inception and had produced a running catalog of confrontations between the teams Musk directed and the civil servants, inspectors general, congressional oversight committees, and federal judges whose various authorities overlapped with the territory the reform project was moving through. What was new in the spring of 2027 was the quality of the friction, the sense shared by observers across a wide range of political positions that the confrontation had graduated from the phase of preliminary skirmishing into something with more structural consequence, a phase in which the outcomes of specific encounters would determine not just the immediate question in dispute, but the shape of the institutional landscape in which all subsequent questions would be adjudicated. The administrative law scholars, who had been watching the process with the focused alarm of people whose entire professional framework was organized around the proposition that the procedures of government exist for reasons that are not fully visible in the short term, were publishing at a pace and with an urgency that had not characterized the field since the 1930s. The congressional committees with oversight jurisdiction over the federal agencies most affected by the reform project were conducting hearings that had the texture of something between a legal proceeding and a constitutional argument, which was appropriate because that was approximately what they were. The obstacle that first principles thinking encountered when applied to governance was not computational. It was not, at its root, even political, though politics was the medium through which it expressed itself. The obstacle was epistemological, and it was the same obstacle that first principles thinking always encounters in domains where the system being analyzed is not fully decomposable into its physical constituents, where the behavior of the whole cannot be derived from the properties of the parts, because the whole contains emergent properties that arise from the relationships between the parts and that disappear when you remove a part to examine it in isolation. A rocket is a system of this kind in certain respects, but it is a system whose emergent properties, thrust, trajectory, structural integrity, can be measured precisely, can be tested against mathematical models that all competent analysts agree on, and can be improved by interventions whose effects can be observed and quantified in controlled conditions. A government is a system of this kind in a different and more intractable sense. Its emergent properties, legitimacy, accountability, the diffuse trust that allows a population to accept outcomes it did not choose, cannot be measured with comparable precision, cannot be tested in controlled conditions, and do not respond to intervention in ways that are predictable from the properties of the components. When Musk removed a component of the federal administrative structure, because his analysis indicated that the component was redundant or ineffective or operating at a cost that exceeded its output, he was applying a model that assumed the system's emergent properties would survive the intervention. The people who argued that he was wrong were not arguing that his assessment of the component was incorrect. They were arguing that his model of the system was incomplete, that it did not account for the properties that only became visible when components were removed, and that the properties it did not account for were, in some cases, the most important ones. The revealing action of this chapter occurred not in Washington, but in a conversation that took place in late March 2027, in a room in Austin, between Musk and a constitutional lawyer who had been brought in, not at Musk's request, but at the request of a senior member of his reform team, who had concluded that the project needed someone capable of explaining, in terms Musk would engage with rather than dismiss, the specific ways in which the model he was applying was generating consequences that the model did not predict. The lawyer was not a critic of the reform project's goals. She had written extensively about federal administrative bloat, about the ways in which procedural accretion had reduced the government's capacity to function effectively, about the genuine need for structural reform of the kind the project was attempting. She had been asked to the meeting because she was credible in the domain and because she was not known as an opponent. She spent approximately 40 minutes presenting her analysis, which was organized around a specific set of case studies, interventions the reform project had made that had produced unintended consequences of a particular type, Cases where the removal of a process or a position or an institutional check had created a vacuum that was subsequently filled by something worse than what had been removed, or had revealed a dependency that the analysis had not identified. She presented this carefully with specific evidence, in the mode of a person who has prepared to engage with a precise and skeptical interlocutor. Musk listened, which he did, and asked questions, which were good questions, and then said, "The solution to a bad check is a better check, not preserving the bad one." She agreed with this. She then said, "The problem is that you're removing checks before the better ones exist, and in the interval, there's no check." There was a silence. Then Musk said, "How long is the interval?" She said she didn't know, that it depended on what Congress did, on what the courts did, on decisions that were not within his control or hers. He said, "That's the problem with your model. It has too many variables I can't affect." She said, "That's not a problem with my model. That's a description of what governance is." The meeting ended shortly afterward. The lawyer was not invited back, which was noticed by the person who had invited her, who drew from this a conclusion they subsequently acted on by submitting their resignation, which Musk accepted without the conversation that the person had expected to accompany the acceptance. The figure whose relationship to Musk most illuminates this chapter is not a politician or a lawyer or a civil servant, but Walter Isaacson himself, not as a participant but as a precedent. Isaacson had published his biography of Musk in 2023, having spent approximately 2 years in close access to the subject, and the book had done what serious biography at its best does. It had produced a portrait sufficiently detailed and sufficiently honest that its subject had found in it things he recognized and things he disputed, and things that arrived with the particular discomfort of being seen clearly by someone whose job is seeing clearly. Musk had not been uniformly pleased with the book, which was expected, but his engagement with it had been more substantive than the engagement of most biographical subjects, which was revealing. He had disputed specific characterizations, engaged specific arguments, pushed back in the register of someone who is taking the interpretation seriously rather than dismissing it. What he had not done, in any public forum or private account that subsequently emerged, was engage the book's most structurally significant observation, which was that the traits enabling his greatest achievements were inseparable from the traits producing his greatest costs, and that the inseparability was not accidental but constitutive. By 2027, the question Isaacson had posed implicitly had become the central question of Musk's public life, not because a biographer had raised it, but because the scale of what Musk was doing had made it impossible to avoid. A man whose first principles thinking had reformed aerospace and energy and communications was now applying the same thinking to governance, and the question of whether first principles could solve governance the way it had solved rocket thrust was no longer a theoretical question. It was being answered in real time, in the federal agencies whose structures were being altered, in the courts that were reviewing those alterations, and in the constitutional fabric that the alterations were testing in ways that had not been tested in this specific form before. What first principles thinking, as Musk practiced it, required as a precondition was the ability to identify the actual goal of the system being analyzed, the thing the system was genuinely for, stripped of the accumulated purposes that institutional history had attached to it. With a rocket, this was achievable. The goal was to place a given mass in a given orbit at a given cost, and everything about the rocket could be evaluated against that goal with a precision that the goal's clarity made possible. With a government program, the goal identification step produced a problem that the subsequent analysis could not overcome, because government programs typically have multiple goals, some of which are in tension with each other, some of which are not explicit in any document, and some of which are the product of political negotiations that were themselves the mechanism by which competing legitimate interests were reconciled. When Musk identified the goal of a federal program as the delivery of a specific service at a specific cost, he was not wrong about that being one of the program's goals. He was applying a model that treated the other goals, the geographic distribution of benefits, the employment of workers in specific communities, the symbolic commitment to a specific value that the program's existence represented, as inefficiencies rather than as features, because his model did not have a category for a goal that could not be optimized. The people who depended on those other goals, who had organized their lives and their communities around the assumption that the system would continue to honor them, were encountering the reform project not as an optimization of a system they participated in, but as the elimination of a commitment they had relied on. And the difference between those two experiences was the difference between a technical intervention and a political one. And the political one had political consequences that the technical model had not included in its projections. In the spring of 2027, the projections were being revised. Not by Musk. Revision of this kind was not in his operating procedure, which treated the gap between projection and outcome as a signal to push harder rather than a signal to reconsider the model. They were being revised by the people around him who were watching the gap accumulate, who were tracking the legal challenges and the congressional responses, and the polling that showed the reform project's public support eroding in the specific populations whose support it most needed to maintain the political conditions that made the project possible. The revisions were happening in private, in the careful language of people who have learned that delivering unwelcome information to this particular recipient requires a specific packaging, not as a challenge to the model, but as additional data that the model can incorporate, new variables that the analysis had not previously included, inputs that would allow the projection to be updated without requiring the fundamental premise to be questioned. Whether this packaging would work, whether the data would be incorporated or set aside, whether the model would prove capable of the kind of self-revision that the situation was beginning to require. These were questions that the spring of 2027 was actively generating without yet producing their answers. The thing about first principles as a problem-solving methodology that its most committed practitioners understand and its critics often miss is that it is not a guarantee of correct answers. It is a guarantee of honest questions. Strip away the assumptions, Musk had said in 100 variations across 100 contexts, and ask what is actually true. The methodology had produced, in the domains where he had applied it most fully, results that had vindicated the approach beyond what its critics had thought credible. But the methodology is only as powerful as the completeness of the decomposition it begins with. And the decomposition of a government is not complete when you have identified its budget lines and its head count and its output metrics, any more than the decomposition of a human being is complete when you have identified its cellular components. What is left out of the decomposition is not nothing. It is, in some cases, everything that matters, and the spring of 2027 was the season in which the things left out of the decomposition were beginning to make themselves known in the ways that omitted things always eventually do. Not through argument, which Musk could engage and rebut and dismiss, but through consequence, which arrives on its own schedule, and does not wait for the model to be ready to receive it, and whose arrival, in the specific case of democratic governance tested at the specific scale and pace that the reform project had chosen, was going to produce a confrontation that no whiteboard question, however honest, had yet fully prepared anyone in that room to navigate. Chapter 99. The Multiplanetary Insurance Policy for Consciousness. He stood at the edge of the observation deck at Boca Chica in the hour before the launch window opened, in the specific silence that descends on a launch site when the countdown has passed the point of reversal, and the people who have been managing contingencies for months have run out of contingencies to manage, and there's nothing left to do but wait for the physics. The vehicle on the pad was not the largest starship ever assembled, but it was the most capable, and the payload it carried, a suite of surface systems designed to operate autonomously on the Martian surface for a minimum of 26 months, had been the work of 1,100 engineers across 4 years and represented in its aggregate mass and its aggregate purpose the most complex thing that humanity had ever attempted to land on another planet. Musk was not on the communications loop. He had removed himself from it an hour earlier, which was unusual, and which the launch director had noted without asking about it, because there are things you do not ask the person who built the rocket on the morning the rocket flies. He was watching the vehicle with the stillness of someone who has moved past the operational into something else, past the engineering, past the logistics, past the accumulated decisions and revisions and failures and recoveries that had produced this particular machine standing on this particular pad in this particular year, into whatever it is that a person inhabits when the thing they have been building toward for their entire conscious life is 22 minutes from either existing or not. His face, in the photographs taken by the SpaceX communications team that morning and released afterward, showed nothing that a caption could easily name. It showed the face of a man who has arrived somewhere and does not yet know what arriving means. The summer of 2027 was the summer in which the question of human survival ceased to be, for the people who thought about it most carefully, an abstraction. The climate data released by NOAA in June of that year, the warmest 18-month period in the instrumental record, by a margin that the climate scientists briefing congressional committees described as outside the envelope of prior projections, a phrase that carries more weight than its technical register suggests, had arrived simultaneously with a geopolitical situation in 3 separate regions of the world that the security analysts were describing, in the careful language of people who have been wrong before about thresholds, as more structurally unstable than any comparable configuration since 1962. The AI safety researchers, who had been arguing since the early 2020s that the development of artificial general intelligence represented an existential risk of a category comparable to nuclear weapons, had published in the spring of 2027 a report whose authors included 12 Nobel laureates and whose conclusions were not alarmist in their register and were nevertheless alarming in their content. The timeline for systems capable of recursive self-improvement had contracted, they assessed, to a window that could not be described as comfortably distant, and the governance frameworks in place to manage that transition were not adequate to the task by a margin that the report quantified with a precision that made it more, not less, difficult to read. Musk had read the report. He had not commented on it publicly, which was itself notable, because he commented publicly on nearly everything that bore on the domains he operated in. The silence was the kind that accumulates meaning rather than dissipating it, and the meaning it had accumulated, among the people who watched him closely enough to read his silences, was that the report had confirmed something he had already been carrying, and that what he had been doing in the years since he last commented extensively on AI risk was not changing his view but building his response to it. The response was the vehicle on the pad. Or rather, the vehicle on the pad was the most visible component of the response, the part that could be photographed and filmed and understood by anyone who looked at it as an object in the physical world. The less visible components were the ones that had occupied the deeper structure of his thinking across the preceding years, and that had shaped decisions at every level of his organizations in ways that were only legible if you were tracking the pattern rather than the individual instances. The XAI systems that had been trained on the most comprehensive data set of human knowledge ever assembled were not, in Musk's operational framework, simply a commercial AI product competing in a market with OpenAI and Google and the other major labs. They were a preservation medium, an attempt to encode the accumulated cognitive and cultural output of human civilization in a form that could survive the loss of the physical substrate it had originally been produced by. The Starlink constellation, which provided communications infrastructure to populations across the Earth, was not, in the same framework, simply a revenue-generating satellite internet service. It was a nervous system, a communications layer that would remain operational in scenarios where ground-based infrastructure had been compromised, and that had been designed with a redundancy and a resilience that the commercial case for it did not fully require, but the existential case for it did. The Optimus program was not, at the level of the framework, simply an automation technology that would reduce labor costs and increase productive output. It was a capability multiplier for a small founding population that might, in a scenario that Musk regarded as genuinely possible, need to build a civilization from a severely depleted starting point, either on Earth or elsewhere. The framework connected these things. The things, taken individually, looked like a portfolio of ambitious companies. Taken as a framework, they looked like a survival plan, and the difference between those two readings was the difference between understanding Musk as an entrepreneur and understanding him as something that the vocabulary of entrepreneurship was not designed to describe. The conflict of this chapter was the oldest one in the history of individuals who have believed themselves to be acting on behalf of species-level imperatives, the conflict between the scope of the mission and the legitimacy of the authority to pursue it. Musk had not been elected to make decisions about the survival of human consciousness. He had not been appointed, had not been confirmed by anybody, had not been granted the authority by any democratic process to determine that a multi-planetary civilization was the correct response to the risks facing humanity, or that his particular version of it was the form that response should take, or that the resources and the infrastructure and the institutional relationships he had organized in pursuit of it were being organized correctly. He had arrogated this authority to himself, as all world historical figures who act on species-level convictions have arrogated it to themselves, through the combination of capability and will that does not ask permission because it does not recognize the permission-granting institution as having standing to grant or withhold it. The critics of this arrogation were numerous and serious, and included people who did not object to the goal, but objected to the governance, who thought that the question of how humanity should insure itself against existential risk was precisely the kind of question that should be decided through deliberative processes that included everyone affected by the answer, rather than by the judgment of a single individual whose resources and capabilities happened to make unilateral action possible. Musk's response to this criticism, when he made it, was not that the critics were wrong, but that the deliberative processes they were defending were too slow, that the threats were real and compounding, and that the time required for the governance they envisioned exceeded the time available before the risks they were governing against had compounded beyond the reach of any response. He may have been right. The critics may have been right. These two things were not mutually exclusive, which was the most uncomfortable feature of the argument, and the reason it resisted the resolution that both sides sought. The moment that is most revealing in this chapter occurred inside a meeting in late July 2027, 6 weeks before the Mars launch window, in a room at SpaceX where Musk convened the small group of people he had asked to serve as something between an advisory council and an ethics board for the Mars program, a group whose composition he had selected personally, whose deliberations he participated in without chairing, and whose function was never formally defined in any organizational document because formally defined function would have required a formally defined relationship to the decision-making process, and Musk had not been willing to specify that relationship in terms that would make it binding. The meeting was working through the question of what the uncrewed mission's surface operations should prioritize if only partial objectives could be achieved, a contingency planning exercise for scenarios where something went wrong after landing. One member of the group, a philosopher of science whose work on the ethics of existential risk had been cited in the XAI safety documentation, argued that the top priority should be the establishment of a communications relay capable of transmitting the maximum possible data back to Earth before power failure, on the grounds that the information value of the mission exceeded its material value. Another member, an aerospace engineer who had spent 30 years at NASA before joining the group, argued that the top priority should be the deployment of the long-duration power system, on the grounds that a mission that preserved its operational capability for the full 26 months produced more value than one that front-loaded data transmission at the expense of longevity. Musk listened to both arguments with the focused attention he brought to technical disagreements he had not pre-decided, and then said, "Both of you are optimizing for Earth's ability to use what we learn. I want to optimize for the surface system's ability to continue operating regardless of what Earth can receive. The value of this mission is not the data it sends back. The value is that it stays alive." He said this quietly, without emphasis, in the tone of a person clarifying a premise rather than winning an argument, and the room received it with the stillness of people recognizing that the framing has shifted in a way that changes everything that follows. The figure whose relationship to Musk most illuminates this chapter is Bill Nye, which will surprise readers who know Nye primarily as a television educator and Musk primarily as an industrial titan, and whose surprise is the point. Nye and Musk had a relationship that was not close and not warm, and that had become, across the years of Starship development, publicly contentious in ways that tracked the deeper disagreement between them with unusual clarity. Nye had argued, on multiple occasions and in multiple forums, that the resources being devoted to Mars colonization would produce more value for human survival if redirected toward addressing the existential risks that humans faced on Earth: climate change, biodiversity loss, the political and economic instabilities that made catastrophic conflict more likely. He had made this argument not as a technophobe, but as someone who understood and valued space exploration, and who nevertheless believed that the sequencing Musk had chosen was wrong, that you do not build a lifeboat before you have tried to stop the ship from sinking. Musk had responded to this argument with a consistency that itself revealed his premises. He did not dispute the value of the Earth-focused interventions Nye was prioritizing. He disputed the logical structure that made them alternatives to the Mars program rather than complements to it. His position was that the argument for choosing between planetary protection and multiplanetary expansion assumed a scarcity of resources and attention that he did not accept, and that accepting it would mean accepting a constraint that the first principles analysis did not require. What the exchange between them illuminated, conducted as it was in public forums over years, was not a disagreement about values, but a disagreement about probability, about how likely the catastrophic scenarios were, about how much time remained before they became irreversible, about whether the insurance policy of a second planet was worth its premium given the other uses to which the premium could be put. These are questions that cannot be resolved by analysis alone, because they require probability estimates for events that have not occurred, and that the historical record does not adequately constrain. People who are equally rational and equally informed can arrive at different estimates. The estimates that organize your behavior will determine, in a very real sense, what kind of future gets built. The launch window opened at 6:47 in the morning, and the vehicle left the pad on schedule, which was itself a statement, not just of engineering competence, but of something larger that Musk had been trying to say for 25 years, and that only the vehicle leaving the pad on schedule could fully say, because it was a statement that could only be made by doing the thing, and not by describing the intention to do it. As the starship cleared the tower, and the sound reached the observation deck, and the light of the engines turned the pre-dawn sky a color that does not have a common name, and the telemetry confirmed nominal performance across all 33 engines, and the vehicle began its gravity turn toward the trajectory that would, in 7 months, deliver its cargo to the surface of another planet, Musk did something that the people nearby noted and did not entirely know what to do with. He did not cheer. He did not raise a fist or embrace anyone standing near him. He watched the vehicle until it was no longer visible to the naked eye, which took about 90 seconds, and then he looked at the sky where it had been for another few seconds, and then he took his phone out of his pocket and began reading something which was, everyone who knew him recognized, the behavior of a person who has already moved to the next thing, because for Musk the launch was not the achievement. The launch was the beginning of the next set of problems, and the problems were where he lived, and the sky where the vehicle had been was already empty, and there was work to do. What no one on the observation deck was positioned to know, in the particular clarity of that July morning, was that the same 7 months that the vehicle would spend crossing the void between planets would be the 7 months in which the consequences of everything Musk had built and decided and pursued and declined to be governed were going to arrive simultaneously, from directions that the map on the wall in Austin had not shown, and that the first principles analysis had not predicted, and that the framework connecting the companies and the missions and the children, and the whiteboards and the sleepless nights, and the burning conviction that consciousness was too precious and too fragile to trust to a single world, had not, for all its ambition and all its genuine insight, been designed to address, because the framework, like all frameworks built by a single mind, however extraordinary, contained the shape of that mind's blind spots as precisely as it contained the shape of its vision, and the blind spots were about to become for the first time impossible to navigate around. Chapter 100. The End of the Beginning. 2026 and the New Humanity. The man's name was not released, and his face was not shown, and the statement he gave to the small group of Neuralink researchers in the Austin clinical facility was recorded but not published, and all of these absences were deliberate, because Neuralink's communications team had spent considerable effort learning from the first implant patient's experience that the public appetite for this particular story had a quality of intensity that required careful management, and that the line between inspiration and spectacle was thin enough that crossing it unintentionally could compromise both the patient's dignity and the program's credibility in ways that would be difficult to recover from. What was released, in a 4-paragraph statement on a Tuesday morning in the late autumn of 2026, was this: a patient with a degenerative neurological condition that had progressively eliminated his ability to communicate through any conventional means had, following the implantation of a second-generation Neuralink device and a calibration period of 11 weeks, composed a message to his family. The message was 340 words long. It had taken him 47 minutes to compose it. It was the first extended communication he had been able to produce in 3 years. The statement did not reproduce the message, which was private, and did not describe its contents, which were personal, and did not attempt to characterize what the composing of it had meant to the man who composed it, because some things are not available to characterization by anyone other than the person who experienced them. And the Neuralink communications team, to their credit, had understood this and had left that space empty. Musk read the statement before it was released, made 2 edits to the phrasing, and approved it without the additions that his usual public communications instinct might have suggested, which was itself a form of restraint that the people who worked with him noted and interpreted as evidence that this one, of all the things he had built, had reached something in him that the others had not reached in quite the same way. The late autumn of 2026 arrived inside a civilization that was simultaneously more connected and more fragmented than any civilization in recorded history. Connected at the level of information, where the Starlink constellation and the fiber networks and the platform algorithms had produced a condition in which a person in rural Malawi and a person in downtown Tokyo were exposed to substantially overlapping streams of text and image and video. Fragmented at the level of meaning, where the shared exposure to information had produced not shared understanding, but an acceleration of the divergence between interpretive communities whose premises were so different that the same facts arrived in them as different realities. The Neuralink program was entering this landscape at a moment when the concept of the boundary between human cognition and digital information was already under pressure from a dozen directions that did not require a device implanted in the skull. The AI systems that a significant fraction of the developed world's knowledge workers were using daily had begun to function less as tools that humans directed and more as cognitive partners whose contributions were becoming difficult to disentangle from the human contributions they were mixed with. The social media platforms, and especially X under Musk's ownership, had evolved their algorithmic amplification to a degree that the information a person encountered was shaped by a system whose operations were not visible to the person and not fully understood even by the system's engineers. The distinction between thinking and being thought through, between cognition that originates in the individual and cognition that is produced in the individual by the environment the individual inhabits, had been eroding for years in ways that the culture had processed through memes and anxiety and the occasional academic paper without arriving at a stable response. Into this erosion, Neuralink was preparing to introduce something that was not a metaphor. The conflict of this final chapter was not between Musk and a regulator or a rival or a political institution, though those conflicts continued and would continue. It was a conflict that the 340-word message in the Austin clinical facility had made suddenly, quietly undeniable. The conflict between the genuine and profound good that the technology could do and the genuine and profound transformation of what it meant to be human that the technology, at scale, would produce, and the absence of any serious collective process for deciding whether the transformation was one humanity wanted to make and on whose terms it wanted to make it. The FDA's approval framework for neural implants had been developed through a process that was rigorous by the standards of its domain, and that was oriented, as medical device regulation is oriented, toward the questions of safety and efficacy for the individuals receiving the device. It was not oriented, could not, in its current form, be oriented toward the question of what happens to the concept of individual cognition, to legal personhood, to privacy, to the meaning of testimony or consent or creative authorship, when the boundary between a human brain and a digital network becomes permeable in both directions. These were questions that philosophers had been raising since the first Neuralink implant had been announced, and that the philosophy journals had been processing with their characteristic combination of rigor and institutional invisibility, and that the regulatory frameworks had acknowledged in the hedged language of people who understand that a question is important without yet knowing how to make it actionable. They were also questions that Musk had addressed in various public contexts with a consistency of framing that revealed his genuine position. The boundary between human cognition and digital information was already permeable, already being crossed every time a person used a search engine or a calculator or a GPS navigation system. And the Neuralink device was a quantitative extension of a qualitative transformation that had already occurred, and the people raising alarms about it were applying a model of human cognitive purity that had not accurately described human cognition for at least 2 decades. He was not wrong about this. He was also not addressing the specific ways in which the directness of the neural interface, the bypassing of the sensory and motor intermediaries that had always mediated the relationship between human minds and their tools, changed the nature of the integration in ways that the smartphone analogy did not capture. Both things were true. The space between them was where the most important decisions of the coming generation would be made. And the decisions were beginning, whether the decision-making frameworks were ready or not. The revealing action of this chapter, the keyhole moment that opens onto the largest room, occurred not in a clinical facility or a boardroom or a congressional hearing, but in a conversation that Musk had in late November 2026 with a Neuralink patient who had agreed to speak with him directly without the presence of the clinical team, which was unusual and had required a specific consent process that the IRB had reviewed carefully. The patient was a woman in her early 40s who had lost the use of her hands to a progressive condition, and who had been using the second-generation device for 4 months, and who had, in that time, returned to her profession, which was writing. Not dictation to text, not the approximated version of writing that adaptive technology had made possible, but the direct, unmediated translation of intention into text that the Neuralink interface allowed when calibrated correctly. She had agreed to speak with Musk because she wanted to tell him something specific, which was that the experience of writing through the device was not the same as the experience of writing had been before her condition progressed. Not worse. Not better. Different in a way she was still finding the vocabulary for, in which the relationship between the thought and its expression had a different latency, a different texture, a quality she described as closer, and also somehow more exposed, as if the usual distance between thinking something and saying it, which I never noticed until it was gone, had been a kind of protection I didn't know I needed. Musk listened to this with the kind of absolute stillness he brings to information that is genuinely new to him, not new as a data point but new as a category of experience his models had not contained. When she finished, he asked 2 questions, both technical, about the specific parameters of the calibration that had produced the effect she described. Then he said, "That's important. Write about it. Whatever you can." She told him she was already writing about it. He nodded, and the conversation moved to other things, and afterward the Neuralink team lead, who had been outside the room, noted that Musk spent the drive back to the office not on his phone but looking out the window, which was, by the established behavioral lexicon of the people who worked closely with him, the sign that something had entered his thinking that had not yet been resolved into action, which meant it was still at that moment genuinely thinking. The figure whose presence is essential to this final chapter is Siobhan Zalise, who had been present at Neuralink across the years of the device's development in the dual and never fully reconciled role of executive and mother of the founder's children, and whose relationship to the technology was therefore both professional and intimate in a way that was true of no one else in the organization. By the autumn of 2026, Zalise had moved into a role at Neuralink that was less formally operational and more strategically oriented, focused on the questions of what the technology should become rather than the questions of how to build what it was currently being built to be. And in this role she had become, within the organization, the person most consistently raising the category of question that the woman in the clinical conversation had gestured toward, not whether the device worked, but what working meant, what it changed about the person who wore it, what it required of the society that would contain people who wore it. She raised these questions not as obstacles to the program, but as design inputs, in the register of an engineer identifying requirements that the current specification did not capture. Her relationship with Musk in this period had evolved into something that the people who observed them in professional contexts described as more equal than it had previously been. Not equal in the sense of comparable authority, but equal in the sense that she was one of the few people in his orbit who could introduce a consideration he had not weighted correctly, and have it land as information rather than as interference. This was, by the winter of 2026, a short list, and her presence on it was a consequence of years of demonstrating that her considerations were worth his attention, and of his having, in this specific domain, the unusual willingness to accept that there were things he had not fully modeled. What the autumn of 2026 represented, in the longest view available to anyone attempting to understand it in real time, was a threshold that was easier to identify in retrospect than in the moment of crossing it, as thresholds of this magnitude always are. The first Neuralink patient who had composed a message to his family. The Starship vehicle on its way to Mars. The Optimus units in the distribution centers and the manufacturing plants. the XAI systems and the diagnostic pipelines, and the logistics networks and the financial infrastructure. The Starlink constellation over the heads of 4 billion people. The children in Austin and Los Angeles, growing up inside the infrastructure their father had built, inheriting a world whose shape bore his intentions in the way that a city bears the intentions of the people who laid its streets, not determinatively, not permanently, but consequentially enough that navigating it without understanding those intentions would mean being shaped by forces you could not see. The Musk era, if that was what it was, had not begun with a single event or a single decision or a single invention. It had begun the way geological eras begin, through the accumulation of pressures that were individually manageable and collectively transformative, reaching a threshold at which the world they had been pressing against was no longer the world that existed. The question that this threshold posed, and that the 340-word message and the patient's description of writing as exposure and the map on the wall, and the 7 months of transit time between Earth and Mars and the whiteboard question, and all the other specific moments this account has tried to render with fidelity to their particularity were all finally asking, was not whether Elon Musk was a great man in the sense that biography has traditionally meant greatness. The evidence that he was consequential was no longer available to dispute. It was not whether his intentions were good, which they appeared in their complex and sometimes self-serving and sometimes genuinely visionary way to be. It was not even whether the civilization he was building was one that the people who would inhabit it would find worth inhabiting, though that question would be answered in time by the people who had no choice but to answer it. The question was older and simpler, and had been posed in various forms by every civilization that had arrived at a moment of irreversible technological transition, and had looked at the person or the institution or the force that had brought it there and had asked, who decided this, and on whose authority? And what recourse do we have if the answer is wrong? And what does it mean that we are already living inside it before we have answered those questions? And whether the consciousness that Musk had devoted his life to preserving, extending and eventually transporting to other planets was the kind of consciousness that could finally be trusted with that much power concentrated in that few hands, was a question that the first 100 years of his century had not yet answered, but that the second 100 would not be able to avoid. The second-generation Neuralink device implanted in the man whose name was not released was, at the moment this biography concludes, functioning within normal parameters. And the man was, by the account of his clinical team, writing every day. And what he was writing was his own. And the question of how long that last sentence would remain unambiguously true was one that Siobhan Zalise had already begun, in a document that no one outside her immediate circle had yet read, to carefully and rigorously answer. Whether a single individual should possess the power to shape the trajectory of human evolution remains the ultimate question of our time. But as the physical and digital frontiers continue to blur, one truth is undeniable. We are all living in the world he is building. This concludes The Gravity Breaker, an exhaustive history of Elon Musk. Thank you for listening.